The bridge was 9 feet wide and 300 feet long, and Aragorn crossed it in 11 running strides before the first crack reached the center arch. He did not look back. A ranger learns early that looking back costs the same time as a sword thrust and returns nothing of value. What he heard behind him was sufficient, stone fracturing in a register that had nothing to do with combat. A structural collapse working outward from a single anchor point, and beneath it, beneath everything, the sound of a whip. He had heard whips before. The kind men use on horses in the Pelennors training yards. The kind overseers use in Mordor's slave camps, according to the reports that reached the Nidane on cold winter nights. He had never heard anything like this. A sound that arrived at the ear and kept arriving, that did not decay the way impact sounds decay, but sustained itself. A crack extending into a shriek, extending into a frequency that operated somewhere between hearing and the body's oldest instructions. He crossed the final arch and did not stop running. The last sound Gandalf made on the Bridge of Khazad-dûm was not a word. He had said what needed saying. The words he had spoken, "You shall not pass," had not been a command in any conventional sense. They had been a statement of nature, the way a bulkhead states the sea's limits. He was a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. There was in him something that predated the Balrog's waking, and the Balrog's master, and the Balrog's master's master, by measures of time that no mortal language had units for. The bridge would break. He had known it would break. That was the point. What he had not calculated was the whip. It came from below. The Balrog fell. He felt the specific give of stone under load suddenly released. The floor of the world dropping away, and the whip came with it. The last reflex of a Maia whose nature is destruction, and whose destruction, even in falling, reaches for purchase. There was no strategy in it. It was the way fire reaches for fuel in the moment before it dies. Not a plan, simply an impulse that does not know how to be anything other than what it is. The whip found Frodo's chain. Gandalf had time for one observation. Not a thought about Frodo. Not a thought about the fellowship or the road ahead or the 30 years of preparation that had led to this bridge. A single clinical recognition from the part of his mind that had been reading magical objects since before the Third Age began, the part that had held Bilbo's ring over a fire in Bag End and watched the letters surface from the gold like a wound reopening. The ring is touching fire. It is not being destroyed. Below, in the dark water at the chasm's base, the ring pressed against living fire for the first time in 3,000 years. It did not melt. It blazed. The fire letters surfaced along its band and burned, not orange, not gold, but a white so pure it had no warmth in it, and for 4 seconds their inscription lit the black water below Khazad-dûm with a light that the deep things had not seen since the world's forging. Then Gandalf fell, and the dark closed over everything, and there was no more light. Frodo felt it leave. Not taken, not pulled, not stolen. It left. The chain snapped at the link nearest the clasp, with a sound like a flawed glass finally finding its fracture point. One moment the weight was there, that specific gravity he had carried from the Shire to Rivendell to this bridge. The weight he had stopped noticing the way you stop noticing the weight of your own head. The next moment it was gone, and the absence was heavier than the object had ever been. He ran because the others were running, and the bridge was falling, and there was nothing else his body knew how to do. He was aware of his hand going to his chest. Once, twice, 3 times in the next 40 strides. The gesture of checking, the body's habit operating without the mind's permission. The broken chain was still there, swinging cold against his breastbone. Nothing hung from it. He ran. Boromir carried the hobbits across the gate threshold. Not because they could not run, they were running, but because the final section between the bridge and the gate crossed open stone at speed. And in the dark and the smoke, and the particular quality of confusion that fills air when something impossible has just occurred, carrying them was faster and more certain than watching them navigate it alone. He set Merry down at the threshold. Set Pippin down. Turned, he counted. 8. The counting took 2 seconds. He counted again because the number was wrong. 9 had entered Moria 3 days ago. 9, a number that had acquired in those days the specific weight of a formation, a thing whose integrity was the condition of everything else. 8 is not 9. The difference between those two numbers, when you have been raised in the house of the steward of Gondor to understand that numbers have consequences, is not a mathematical difference. It is a catastrophic one. Legolas reached the gate last among the 8. He stood at its threshold and looked back into Moria's dark for 6 full seconds. His face in that moment was not what faces look like in grief. It was older than grief, the expression of someone who has seen enough endings across enough centuries to have developed, by necessity, a specific quality of stillness for them. Not acceptance. Not peace. Simply the recognition that the ending has occurred, and that recognition is now the new ground to stand on. He turned. He did not speak. Gimli sat on the stone 20 feet from the gate with his axe on the ground and his hands on his axe and his forehead on his hands. He was not moving. The line of his shoulders carried everything that can be carried without making a sound. Aragorn stood 8 feet from the gate and made himself be still. This was a discipline he had learned in his first decade with the Dunedain, that the mind, in the immediate wake of a shock, produces movement as a substitute for thought. It offers action, any action, as relief from the pressure of new information that has not yet resolved into its actual shape. The ranger's practice is to refuse that movement, to be still, to let the information arrive completely before responding to what it actually is, rather than what the first second suggests it might be. The new information was this: Gandalf was gone. That was the first thing, and it had no tactical implication yet, only its own weight, which was considerable, and he gave it 3 full seconds before moving past it. The ring was gone. That was the second thing, and it was the one that required the most careful handling, because it was the thing everything else depended on. He had seen the bridge fall. He knew, with the certainty of a man who had spent 37 years studying the ring's nature and the histories of those who carried it, that the ring had not reached Orodruin's fire on the way down. It had reached the deep water. It had reached the Balrog. And those two facts, placed together, produced a combination that no council had ever planned for. Not Elrond's, not Mithrandir's, not the long cold councils of the Dunedain in their winter camps along the Greenway. The Balrog was a Maia, of the same order as Sauron in the hierarchy of the Ainur, not a servant born of his making. Its allegiance had never been to the Dark Lord. Its allegiance had been to Morgoth, whose empire predated Sauron's by an age, and Morgoth was gone beyond the walls of the world. And in his absence the Balrog had answered to nothing, not command, not chain of authority, not the ring's long reach across Middle-earth, for 5,000 years. Until now. 37 years. 37 years of preparation for one specific war, one specific enemy, one specific geometry of destruction and resistance. The map of that war had ceased to exist in the 6 seconds it took a whip to find a chain and a bridge to fall into the dark. He reached for Andril. The blade came clear of the scabbard with the sound it always made, the clean ring of reforged steel, a note that carried in its overtones the weight of everything Narsil had been and everything Andril had been made to fulfill. He held it in the gray morning light of the Dimril Dale and looked at it. It was the right weapon for the war they had prepared for. A king's weapon, heavy with lineage and ancient right, built for the reclaiming of a throne from an enemy whose empire ran on political machinery that could be broken if its keystone were removed. Against Sauron's armies, against the structures of his dominion, against the logic of his long patience, Andril was exactly the instrument required. Against a Balrog with the ring fused into its fire, Aragorn did not yet know what it was. He held it for 11 seconds. Then he sheathed it, slowly, with the deliberate care of a man securing a tool he will need later, in a configuration, and for a purpose that have not yet clarified, not with surrender. With the discipline of someone who understands that moving with speed from a position that is wrong is how wrong positions become irreversible ones. Not yet. The words did not require speaking. They were simply true, the way distances are true. The way the gap between where you are and where you need to be is simply a fact about the ground you're standing on. He looked at the peaks above Moria. The smoke columns were already visible against the gray sky, thin and dark, 3 of them, rising from vents that had been cold for 100 years. "Move," said Aragorn, no urgency. Instruction, the register of a man who has located the next step with precision and is now committed to it without remainder. The 8 moved. Frodo walked last, 3 paces behind the others, his hand pressed flat against his breastbone where the broken chain still swung. The Dimril Dale opened before them, wide and cold and full of the particular gray light that arrives before the sun clears the eastern range, the light that shows everything at its actual size, without the mercy of shadow. Behind them, in the dark beneath the mountain, a fire was burning that had not been burning before. It was not getting smaller. The war chief of Moria had survived 17 changes of command. This was not remarkable in isolation. Orcs were numerous, and orc commanders were not, which meant the arithmetic of Moria's internal politics produced a new warlord with the same regularity that the mountain produced cave-ins, unexpectedly with significant collateral damage. And always at someone else's expense if you positioned yourself correctly. The warchief's survival across 17 such transitions was remarkable only when you understood that it was not achieved through strength or cunning in any conventional sense. It was achieved through geography. He was always slightly out of range. Not hiding. Hiding was noticed. Not retreating. Retreating was remembered. Simply occupying, with the quiet consistency of a man who has made a discipline of it, the precise location in any room that was furthest from the point of maximum danger. He had a gift for identifying that point before others recognized it as dangerous. A sensitivity developed across 230 years of Moria's specific political climate, where the difference between being at the center of a moment and being at its periphery was frequently the difference between continuing to exist and not. He registered the change at the 4-hour mark, though he would not have called it registering and would not have called it a change. What he would have said if the warchief had been a creature given to language, which he was not. His method of internal processing being purely practical was that he had an impulse. To move east, not urgently, not in the way the 17 previous changes of command had required movement, which was immediately and with attention to the positions of bladed objects. This was slower, a certainty of direction that had arrived fully formed. The way you arrive at the conclusion that you are hungry not through reasoning but through the simple fact of the feeling's presence. He had been in Moria's upper eastern galleries when it arrived. Counting supplies, which was the permanent occupation of a creature whose survival depended on having resources correctly quantified when everyone else's attention was on the leadership crisis of the moment. He set his tally stick down, stood oriented east. He stood there for 40 seconds, which was 28 seconds longer than he had ever stood still doing nothing in his adult life. Then he picked the tally stick back up and continued counting, because the impulse had not reached the level of instruction, and he had survived this long by not acting on things that had not reached that level. Below him, in the flooded depths of Khazad-dûm's lowest excavated level, a chamber the dwarves had called Narag Mazem in their deep survey records. Before they found what was below it and stopped naming things, the fire was rising. It had been in the water for 14 hours. The water in a 900-foot shaft at the base of the Misty Mountains is cold in the specific way that geological depth produces cold. Not atmospheric, not climatic, but the cold of pressure and time. The cold of the world's interior expressing itself through liquid. 14 hours in that water had not cooled the fire. The water around it had become something between liquid and vapor at a radius of 11 feet. Cycling in a continuous conversion that produced no steam, the fire consumed the water before it could become steam, and in the center of that radius the ring burned against the fire the way the ring had always burned against heat. Fully. Completely. Without defense, as though heat were the state it had been waiting to return to. The inscription was continuous now, not appearing and disappearing with the fluctuation of an external heat source. Simply present, the black speech letters running their full circuit in a light that was not orange and not gold, but a white, that carried in its frequency the specific register of something made in the hottest place in the world, and now returned to an approximation of it. The fire rose, because rising was what fire does. It had no strategy for the ascent, and required none. The shaft walls were stone. Stone did not impede it. The shaft ended in a chamber. The chamber connected to corridors. The corridors connected to the entirety of Khazad-dûm's excavated architecture. 600 years of dwarven engineering, 5 centuries of orc habitation, 6 levels of vertical complexity, and 43 miles of mapped tunnel. All of it connected to the fire now. The hive mind was not a voice. This was the thing that would have confused a scholar, if scholars had been present to observe it, which they were not, and would not have survived being. The ring's domination mechanics operated through desire. It found what a wearer wanted and made itself the means of getting it. This was how it had enslaved the 9 men. How it had worked on Bilbo across 60 years, how it would have worked on Gandalf or Galadriel had either of them been weak enough or strong enough to take it. The mechanism was parasitic. It fed on the host's own ambitions and redirected them. Orcs had no ambitions in any form the ring's architecture could map. What they had, instead, was hierarchy. The deepest structure of an orc's psychology, older than language, older than any individual orc's experience of being alive, was the recognition of the signal that came from above in the chain of command. Not loyalty. Not willingness. Something prior to both, the biological certainty that the signal exists and must be oriented toward, the way iron orients toward a magnet without choosing to. What the ring provided was not a new signal. It provided the oldest signal, the one that predated Sauron's overlay by an age. The Morgoth frequency that had been the original architecture before 3,000 years of Sauron's administrative repatterning had papered over it. It did not arrive as a command, it arrived as a clarity. The things they had been doing, the patrols, the supply management, the 17 cycles of political reorganization, had a new quality of irrelevance, not wrong, simply beside the point of something more fundamental. The first Orc battalion to move was on Moria's second level, Eastern Corridor, 140 yards from the War Chief's supply room. They did not receive an order. They simply reached, simultaneously, across 312 individuals, the same clarity of direction, downward. The movement began without a command being issued, and without any individual Orc making a decision. The battalion moved because the battalion was moving, the way water moves when a channel opens, not because each molecule has been individually persuaded, but because that is where the channel goes. Deeper still, below the excavated levels, below the dwarves' deepest delving, below the flooded shafts and the thermal vents and the geological formations that had no Khazad-dûm names because no dwarf had reached them, things moved that had not moved in 4,000 years. They were not summoned. The Balrog had issued nothing that could be called a summons. But the signal that the ring was amplifying through the fire's nature reached depths that Sauron's reach had never touched. Not because Sauron lacked power, but because Sauron's power was administrative, and the things below were not susceptible to administration. They predated the concept of administration. They predated the concept of being governed by anything external to their own geology-slow consciousness. The signal they received was not a command, it was a resonance. The frequency of the First Age, amplified to a magnitude not broadcast since Angband burned. They did not rise. There was no urgency in them. Urgency was a measure of time, and they did not experience time as mortal things do. They oriented, the way a compass needle orients, not choosing, not deciding, simply aligning with the field that has declared itself the dominant one. They waited, patient, as the rock they moved through. But they were no longer still. By the end of the first week, 4 smoke columns were visible from the Dimrill Dale's northern shepherd track. The shepherd who counted them was 63 years old and had pastured flocks in the valley for 40 of those years. He knew the misty mountains the way you know the wall of the room you have slept in your whole life, not through scholarship, through familiarity, through the accumulated knowledge of decades of watching the same geography in every light and every season. He knew what the peaks above Moria did in winter. He knew what they did in spring thaw. He knew what a natural vent looked like. The thin, white, steam-based exhalation of geothermal activity along the range's eastern face, intermittent and low volume. He counted the 4 columns for 90 seconds. They were dark. They were substantial. They were not intermittent. The one on the northernmost peak was 80 feet across at its base, widening as it rose, the kind of column that implied not a vent but a source. He had walked faster than he had walked in 30 years before he had finished the second count. He did not stop to check a third time. The war chief ran on the 6th day. This was not panic. Panic was a failure of calculation, and the war chief did not fail at calculation. It was the skill that had kept him out of range for 2 centuries. What happened on the 6th day was that his calculation, which had been running continuously since the first impulse arrived, finally produced a result. The result was, the range was closing. Whatever he was staying out of was larger than it had been on the first day. It was larger than it had been yesterday. Its edge was measurable, he had been measuring it, and the rate of the edge's expansion was consistent enough to project. He ran with the specific efficiency of someone who has thought carefully about what direction and what speed give him the longest extension of viable time. He ran east. The eastern gate was 620 yards from his current position. He had been measuring that distance for 3 days. He covered 400 yards before it found him. Not in the way things find you when they are chasing you. Not from outside. From a direction he had no physiological equipment to locate, because it was not outside him. It was the clarification of an impulse he had had for 6 days, the feeling of knowing which direction he already wanted to go, suddenly resolving from a background frequency into a certainty so complete that the word want was no longer accurate. Want implied alternatives. There were no alternatives. His stride did not change. His speed did not change. The eastern gate was 220 yards ahead, and he was running toward it with the same efficiency he had been running toward it for the past 20 seconds. Except that now the efficiency was the rings. He was still running. His legs were still carrying him with the speed and purpose of a creature who had decided to leave and had not changed that decision. His feet, at the 200-yard mark, turned, not against his will. The concept of his will had simply been replaced by a larger version of itself. He turned back toward the fire with the fluid inevitability of water finding the lowest point of a tilted surface. Not forced, not compelled by anything he could locate as external, simply going where he was going. The eastern gate stayed where it was, 200 yards behind him, in the gray morning light of the Dimril Dale, open, functional, available. The warchief did not look back at it. He was already 6 steps into the dark. The order came from Barad-dûr on the 19th day. Not through a palantir. Sauron did not require a palantir to reach the Nine. The communication was more direct than that. More structural. The rings of the Nazgul were subordinate instruments, and through them Sauron's will arrived not as language, but as pressure, the way a hand pressing on a surface does not need to explain itself to the surface. The Nine had spent 3,000 years learning to read that pressure, with a precision that went beyond comprehension into something more absolute. They knew Sauron's will the way a body knows the location of its own joints, not by thinking about it, but by being continuous with it. The order that arrived on the 19th day was unusual in one specific quality. It was uncertain. In 3,000 years of service, across the full span of the Third Age, the Witch King had never received a directive from Barad-dûr that carried uncertainty in its pressure. Sauron's will was many things: absolute, patient, architecturally precise, in a way that no mortal strategic mind could fully track, but it was never uncertain. Uncertainty was for creatures whose information was incomplete. Sauron's information was never incomplete in any domain he had chosen to survey. The directive that arrived on the 19th day carried, beneath its explicit content, a quality of provisional, as though Sauron were issuing the order while simultaneously aware that the information underpinning it might be wrong. The explicit content was this: 1 Nazgul, minimum force, Moria's eastern gate, recover the ring, report. The Witch King delivered the assignment to the youngest of the Nine. Youngest in the sense that his humanity had been most recently consumed, that some residue of mortal decision-making still operated beneath the Wraith architecture. He was, among the Nine, the most capable of processing ambiguous situations without defaulting immediately to the authority of terror. Ambiguous situations required assessment before they required force. He departed Dol Guldur before dawn on the 20th day and flew west. He reached the Dimril Dale on the 22nd day. The valley floor below Moria's eastern gate was recognizable from the descriptions in Sauron's geographical records. The Mirror to the north, its surface dark as unpolished obsidian in the early morning. The Silverlode running cold and clear from its outflow. The shepherd's track along the valley's northern edge. The gate itself. 2 tall pillars of dwarven stone framing a darkness that smelled of hot metal and something older than metal. He circled once at 300 feet. The smoke columns were 4 in number. Dark, continuous, the northernmost had widened since the shepherd's count and was now producing a lateral spread at altitude that the wind from the east was carrying in a flat gray sheet across the Dimril Dale's upper reaches. The valley had the quality of a place that had recently been many things and was now becoming one specific thing that it had not been before. He landed at the gate's threshold and stood for 7 seconds. The ring's voice, which had been constant within his own ring for every moment of his existence as a wraith, a frequency so invariant that it had become indistinguishable from silence, was different here. Not absent. Present in a way that was different from how presence had ever expressed itself before. Louder and simultaneously farther away. As though the signal's volume had increased while its origin had moved somewhere the signal was not designed to reach from. He entered. The eastern corridor of Moria's first level was 40 feet wide and 12 feet high, supported at 60-foot intervals by columns of dwarven stone carved with geometric precision. The dwarves of Durin's folk had built without ornament in the structural sections, function expressed so completely that it achieved its own austere beauty. the way a bridge achieves beauty through the honest expression of load distribution. The torches that had lit this corridor for centuries of orc habitation were out, not extinguished. Consumed, the brackets still held the iron stubs of torch holders, but the metal was soft in the middle section, slightly deformed by heat that had passed through it rather than resting on it. The floor between the first and second columns was dry. Beyond the second column, a residue of mineral deposit that had been Moria's underground river system, he walked through it. His passage, leaving no mark because he had no weight to leave marks with, had been reduced to a fine gray powder that his movement stirred into brief suspension before it settled. The ring's voice grew louder with each column he passed. Not louder in any way that the word louder fully addressed. It was more that the voice was losing its familiar shape, the precise, invariant frequency that had been Sauron's architecture within the One Ring's resonance, and acquiring a different shape in its place. Something that used the same instrument to produce a different sound. The way a room sounds different when someone is already in it. He stopped at the fifth column. The temperature between the fourth and fifth columns was 31 degrees higher than it had been at the gate's threshold. He registered this not through sensation. Sensation was no longer available to him in the mortal sense, but through the structural changes it produced in his wraith form, a slight thinning at the edges of his existence. The outer layers of his spectral architecture responding to an environment they had not been built for. He was not in danger. Not yet. But the gradient between the fourth column and the fifth column was 11 degrees. He calculated forward. The corridor ran for another 300 feet at this width before descending to the second level. If the temperature gradient was consistent, and he had no reason to believe it would become less steep, the midpoint of the descent would produce conditions that his form could not persist in. He stood at the fifth column and faced the dark ahead. The ring's voice was not Sauron's voice anymore. It was using Sauron's instrument. The resonance that ran through every subordinate ring like a signal through a wire, but the content was different. The content was older. It was the frequency of something that had existed before the Third Age's entire architecture of power and dominion, something that Sauron had built his empire on top of without being that thing himself. The Witch King had been in the presence of that frequency once before. In the First Age, in the form of a life that was now so remote it survived only as instinct, the deep body knowledge that certain things are not measured against other things because they are not in the same category. He understood, at the fifth column, what he was being asked to walk toward. He walked toward it anyway. He did not reach the second level. What reached the eastern gate, 4 hours and 7 minutes after he had entered, was a column of black smoke. Not the dark columns rising from the peaks above. Those were geological, mineral-heavy, carrying in their particulate the specific chemistry of heated stone. This was different in composition and in behavior. It moved with a deliberateness that smoke does not move with in the absence of directed wind. It exited the gate at a height of 8 feet and rose to 12 before the valley's air currents took it and began to disperse it. It drifted northeast. The wind from the eastern range caught it at the 200-yard mark and spread it laterally across the Dimril Dale's morning air. By the time it reached the dale's northern end, it was no longer a column. It was a thinning, a quality of darkness in air that would otherwise have been clear. There was no wraith. There was no ring. The Nazgul who had entered at dawn was not present in any form that the word present could be applied to. Not destroyed in the sense that destruction implies a remainder. Not escaped. Not retreated. Simply no longer in the category of things that existed. In Bered Durkar, one of the 9 went dark. The Witch King registered it before Sauron named it, felt it in the structure of the 9's formation the way a formation feels the absence of one of its members, a specific gap in the field of pressure that had been constant for 3 millennia. He had lost Nazgul before, in the temporary sense, the river at the ford, the wounds that unmade their forms without unmaking their existence. Those absences had a quality of suspension, a gap that retained the shape of what had been in it, waiting for reconstitution. This was different. This gap did not retain the shape of what had been in it. It was simply empty, in the way geological spaces are empty, not temporarily unoccupied, but structurally absent, as though that position in the formation had never existed. The Witch King stood before Sauron's eye in Barad-dûrkar's upper chamber and delivered his assessment. The eye was still. In 3,000 years of service, he had observed the eye in many states, focused, searching, burning with the specific quality of active surveillance, compressed with the cold patience of long preparation. He had never seen it still in the way it was still now, not resting, not waiting. Paused, in the manner of a calculating mind that has reached the edge of its prepared contingencies and is in the process of recognizing that the edge is there. He had 4 words. He had considered more words, analysis, context, the logical chain from the Nazgul's entry to the smoke column to the gap in the formation's field. He discarded them. Sauron did not require the chain. Sauron would already have reconstructed the chain from the single data point of the absence. What Sauron required was the one piece of information that Sauron could not extract from the absence alone, the specific quality of what the youngest of the 9 had encountered on the walk to the 5th column. The Witch King chose 4 words. He delivered them without preamble, because preamble would have been a form of softening, and this was not a communication that benefited from softening. It was not destroyed. He waited. The eye was still. It was consumed. 6 seconds of silence followed. The Witch King stood in the silence and observed what 6 seconds of silence from Sauron meant, a mind that processed at the speed of pure will, for which 6 seconds represented not a pause but an absence of output, which was different. An absence of output from a mind that always had output was not a delay. It was the specific quality of a situation for which no instruction had been prepared. The Witch King understood, standing in that silence, that it was more alarming than any order he had received in 3,000 years of service. An order meant that Sauron knew the next step. An order meant that the long architecture of preparation had a response for the current situation, that the contingencies extended to cover what had happened and what was about to happen. The silence meant that they did not. He waited for the silence to end. It did not end. He stood in it with the full discipline of his nature, which had been trained across an age to find in Sauron's directives the complete structure of what was required. The silence offered no structure. He was, for the first time in 3,000 years, standing in a room with the most powerful will in Middle-earth, and the most powerful will in Middle-earth had nothing to tell him. The Witch King did not move. He did not speak again. He stood in the silence the way you stand in a place where the ground has changed and you have not yet looked down to see what it has changed into. He was already afraid. He had been afraid since the 5th column. This was something else, smaller in its expression, more total in its implication. It was the specific weight of being an instrument that has outlasted the plan it was built to execute. Still functional, still present, still waiting for the command that no longer exists to arrive. Galadriel felt it on the 31st day, 3 days before it arrived. This was not foresight in the way mortals used the word, the uncertain, image-fragmented thing that arrived through the mirror in symbols requiring interpretation. This was structural. Nenya's awareness of the ring was not passive surveillance, but active resonance. The 3 had been made to understand the 1, to know its location and condition the way a tuning fork knows the frequency of the note that activates it. For 60 years, that resonance had been oriented toward the northwest, toward the Shire, toward Rivendell, toward the road south that Frodo had walked with the ring hanging from its chain. A fixed point, moving slowly, carrying its specific signature. On the 31st day, the signature changed direction. It was moving east, toward her. She stood at her mirror's basin in the hour before dawn and did not touch the water. She did not need to. The water would show her what the signature meant, would translate its approach into images, into symbolic language, into the mirror's characteristic grammar of might be and could be and what will come if. She did not want symbols. She already knew what the signature meant. She had known what it meant since the moment it changed direction, because there was only one thing it could mean. And she had spent the 30 days since the bridge's fall understanding that this outcome was among the possible ones. She had hoped it would choose a different direction. She left the mirror basin and walked to the flet's eastern edge and looked out across the Malern canopy in the pre-dawn dark. The trees were 60 feet high at their crowns, gold-leafed even in winter. The specific quality of Lothlórien's preserved light making the upper branches visible against the sky's darkness in a way that had no natural explanation. Nenya's warmth was in that light. 3,000 years of sustained intention, the accumulated work of a power that had chosen to build rather than expand, to preserve rather than conquer. She listened to the canopy for 40 seconds. Then she went to find Celeborn. He was already awake. This was not unusual. Celeborn slept little and moved through Caras Galadon's pre-dawn hours with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent 6,000 years finding the early morning's specific quality of silence useful for thought. She found him on the bridge above the inner court, looking east, which told her everything she needed to know about what his own instincts had already told him. She did not soften it. 3 days, she said. He turned to look at her. His face in the pre-dawn light was the face she had known across 6,000 years of the world's continuous diminishment, not old in any mortal sense, but carrying in its stillness the specific weight of someone who has watched enough things end to have developed an accurate sense of what endings look like before they arrive. "The ring," he said, "not a question. What carries it?" He was quiet for 4 seconds. The distinction mattered, and he understood why she had drawn it. "Can Nenya hold?" She looked at him steadily. He already knew the answer. He was asking because the answer required saying aloud before it could become the ground they acted from. "Nenya was made to preserve," she said. "Its independence from Sauron is a consequence of how it was forged. Not a purpose built into it, but an architecture that was never calibrated to his frequency. It has no structure for opposing his will directly, and none at all for what is coming." The evacuation order went out before dawn. She watched it move through Khazad-dûm from the bridge, watched the light change in the flets as the word passed from one to the next. The specific quality of movement that distinguished elvish preparation from mortal urgency. There was no panic in it. Panic was the response of people who had not prepared for the thing that was happening. The elves of Lothlórien had not prepared for this specific thing. No one had. But they had, across 3,000 years of Galadriel's stewardship, developed the general capacity for ordered departure. The capacity lived in their muscle memory and their organizational structures and the particular quality of discipline that comes from a people who have, collectively, survived evacuations before. Celeborn organized the military disposition. She let him. He had the gift for it. The tactical precision that had held the Silver Lode's western bank against Dol Guldar's probing attacks across the Second and Third Ages. The command authority that operated through complete confidence rather than volume. She watched him work for 3 minutes, confirming what she already knew, that the military disposition, however well organized, was not the relevant variable. The relevant variable was Nenya. She went to the tree. The tree at Khazad-dûm's center was the oldest living thing in Lothlórien, not ancient in the way mountains were ancient, but present in the specific way that living things are present, continuously and with each year added to the last, in a chain that stretched back to the Second Age's earliest decades. She had planted it. She remembered the exact quality of the soil on that day, its temperature, its composition, the particular resistance of Lothlórien's earth to the roots of a tree that was not native to it. She placed her hand on its bark and felt Nenya respond. The ring on her finger was warm. It was always warm. 3,000 years of continuous operation had made warmth its default state. The specific temperature of sustained intention. What it was now was warmer. And the quality of the warmth was different, not the warmth of generation, of light being produced and sustained. The warmth of resistance. Nenya was already working, already pressing against the approach, already engaged in the preliminary architecture of the barrier it had deployed 100 times against Sauron's probing attempts over 3 millennia. She felt what it was pressing against. The barrier Nenya built was a lock. That was the correct mechanical metaphor. A structure whose independence from the One Ring's making had allowed it to resist Sauron's specific frequency for 3,000 years, opposing the exact qualities of his approach with the Three's counter-qualities. Preservation against corruption, light against the eyes-consuming darkness, warmth against the cold patience of Mordor's long design. Its purpose had always been preservation. Its resistance to Sauron was the consequence of that purpose's architecture, the way a thing made entirely for building cannot, by its nature, be made into an instrument of unmaking. What was approaching did not have those qualities. It was not Sauron's frequency. It was not a frequency Nenya had any architecture for opposing, because it was not a frequency that had existed when Nenya was made. The lock was perfect. The thing approaching was not the wrong key. It was a fire that had found the door. She stood with her hand on the tree and felt Nenya begin to understand this, which was different from Nenya failing. Understanding came before failure. Understanding was the mind registering what failure will look like before it arrives. She did not remove her hand from the tree. She stood there and let Nenya work, because working was what it had been made to do and it was doing it completely, and the only thing she could give it was the full weight of her will in addition to its own. It would not be enough. She already knew it would not be enough. She stood there anyway. The Balrog entered from the north. It crossed the Anduin above the Nimrodel's confluence on the 34th day, in the hour before midday, and Lothlórien's border guard saw it from the northern flets at a distance of 4 miles. The 4 miles meant nothing. The specific quality of seeing it at 4 miles was that you had enough time to understand what you were seeing before it reached you, which was a different problem from not having that time. The border captain sent his runner south at full speed and remained at his post. He counted 11 elves under his command. He looked at the fire moving toward him across the Anduin plain and made, in the time between the runner's departure and the Balrog's crossing of the first tree line, a series of calculations that were not military but geometrical. Distance, speed, the known dimensions of the Balrog's fire volume against established reference points for scale. He completed the calculations. He stood for 3 seconds with the results. Then he ordered his 11 elves south, and he followed them, and he did not look back. And the correctness of this decision expressed itself in the fact that all 12 of them were alive 4 hours later. Nenya failed in the way she had known it would fail, not with force. The barrier did not crack under the Balrog's approach the way a wall cracks under assault. There was no assault, no directed attack against the ring's architecture. The Balrog was not trying to break through Nenya's defenses. It was not trying to do anything. It was moving west. Lothlórien was west. The barrier was between them and irrelevant to the fire, in the same way that a door is irrelevant to the temperature of the room it separates, once the temperature becomes sufficient. The warmth in Nenya's band shifted at the 300-yard mark from resistance to something she had no operational category for. The heat of the thing being resisted conducting directly through the ring's structure, bypassing the barrier entirely, entering Nenya through the gold itself, because the gold was responding to a fire that spoke its language at a register deeper than the ring's. Enchantments could address. Nenya's warmth drained in 14 seconds. She felt each second. This was the precise figure. She had spent 3,000 years learning to feel time in Nenya's terms, and its terminal event was not fast enough to escape measurement. 14 seconds of the specific sensation of something that has been warm your entire life becoming room temperature, then below room temperature, then the temperature of absence. The light in the Malern canopy went with it. Not all at once. Tree by tree, moving outward from the border, the specific quality of preserved light that had no natural explanation, the Lothlórien glow that had marked the wood on the maps of 3 ages as something set apart from the world's normal operations, faded from the leaves. The leaves did not fall. They were still the same leaves they had been 30 seconds before. They were simply leaves now, gold in the normal way of autumn leaves that are dying rather than the preserved way of Lothlórien's light. She was the last to cross the bridge over the celebrant. She stood at the bridge's southern end and watched. The Malern trees did not burn quickly. She had not expected them to. She had planted the first of them, had overseen the planting of every subsequent one, knew their root systems and their wood density, and the specific resistance their age gave them to ordinary fire. The fire that was moving through them was not ordinary fire, but it was not contemptuous of them either. It had to work for each tree. Each tree required time. She gave them time. She stood at the bridge and watched each one go and did not look away, because these were things she had built, and she owed them witness. The northern edge of the canopy was burning. The fire moved through it with the directional patience of something that is not choosing to burn things so much as burning them, because they are in the direction it is moving. Methodical in the way that geological processes are methodical, not planning, simply proceeding. Celeborn touched her arm once. She did not move. The Balrog passed through the center of Khazad-dûm at the 3-hour mark, without pausing. She watched its light through the burning trees, the golden band at its core, brighter than its own fire, brighter than the Malerns burning around it. A light that had no warmth in it despite its temperature. It passed through the heart of what had been Lothlórien the way a river passes through a gorge, not because it chose the gorge, not because the gorge mattered to it, but because the gorge was in the path of where the river was already going. On the far side of the celebrant, she finally turned away. The bridge was 600 years old. She had walked it thousands of times. She walked it now once more, without looking back, toward the south, and the decisions that the south required. Behind her, the first Malern fell. Lothlórien had not been a conquest. It had been a hallway. They reached the outskirts of Edoras on the 47th day. Aragorn did not go directly to the city. He stopped at the first settlement of any size he had seen since the Dimril Dale, a farmstead 2 miles west of Edoras. 3 buildings and a stable arranged around a central yard, in the practical configuration of people who had lived on open ground long enough to understand that shelter from the eastern wind mattered more than aesthetics. The farmer's family had evacuated. The buildings were intact, the stable still occupied by 4 horses left behind, in whatever calculation of speed versus carrying capacity had governed the departure. He unsaddled his horse, watered it, checked its feet in the methodical sequence the Dínadain used, working heel to toe on the left 4 before moving to the right. A habit so deeply ingrained it required no attention, and therefore left the full weight of his attention available for other things. He worked through the feet of all 4 abandoned horses before he acknowledged what he was doing, which was giving himself time to think, without appearing to stop moving. 37 years of field discipline had produced in him an extensive catalog of tasks that could be performed competently without conscious direction, and he had learned to deploy them when the problem in front of him was the kind that did not respond well to the direct application of focus. The problem in front of him was not tactical. He had no shortage of tactical problems: the Balrog's trajectory, the rate of the environmental transformation, the collapse of every established alliance in the ring's political geography. Those were solvable problems, or at minimum problems with legible shapes that could be worked on from identified angles. The problem he was giving himself time to think about was that he no longer knew what he was for. Legolas found him in the stable at the 2nd hour. He had not been sent, no one sent Legolas anywhere, and the habit of the Fellowship had been, over 47 days, to allow each member the specific geography of solitude their nature required, while maintaining the formation's integrity. Legolas's nature required, occasionally, the direct assessment of a situation that the person inside it could not assess clearly from inside it. He had, across the weeks since the bridge, developed a practitioner's understanding of when Aragorn was thinking, and when Aragorn was avoiding the thing he was supposed to be thinking about. He sat on the stable's partition rail and said nothing for 3 minutes. This was not patience in any effortful sense. Patience was a mortal virtue, a discipline imposed against the natural urgency of mortal time. For Legolas it was simply the correct speed for this conversation, which he understood before Aragorn had spoken a word. "The prophecy," Aragorn said eventually, not as a question. Legolas waited. It was written for a specific war. Aragorn set down the horse's hoof he had been holding and straightened. Against a specific enemy, one whose defeat restored a specific order. He crossed to the opposite wall and sat with his back against it, in the dark between 2 empty stalls. The hands of the king are the hands of a healer. The return of the king. Every word of it is calibrated to the overthrow of Sauron and what follows from that overthrow. A pause. Sauron still exists. He still holds Mordor. The ring simply no longer helps him hold it. Legolas said nothing. This was not an absence of response. It was a response of a specific kind, the kind that communicates, through continued silence, that the person speaking has not yet arrived at the actual question. Aragorn looked at him. Legolas looked back with the expression he had when he was waiting. "There is no kingdom if the world burns," Aragorn said. The words were flat in the way of a man who has been avoiding a sentence for several days and has finally said it aloud and found that it is exactly as large as he thought it was. There is no throne to reclaim from an enemy that is not interested in thrones. There is no healing the hands of a king can do for a population that does not survive the next 3 months. He stopped. The stable was dark except for the ambient gray light through the door's gap, and in that light his face had the specific quality of someone conducting an accurate inventory of a situation and not managing the numbers in their favor. "My father's line has held against Sauron for 3 ages, he said. Isildur failed. Anrion died. The line survived because Sauron wanted the ring more than he wanted the line erased. He could not take both. He chose the ring and allowed us to persist as a problem to be solved later." A pause. What is coming does not make those calculations. Legolas had been alive for 2,800 years. In that time he had heard the word his father used for the thing Aragorn was describing. Not in speeches, not in councils, but in the specific quality of his father's silence on certain evenings in Mirkwood's halls, when the news from the east had been of a particular kind. Thranduil had survived the aftermath of the War of Wrath. He had been young, too young for the fighting itself, old enough to see what the First Age's conclusion left behind. He had never described it in language that Legolas could recall precisely. He had described it in silences that Legolas had spent 2,800 years learning to read. He knew what Aragorn was asking, behind the question he was actually saying. He knew the answer. He had known it since the bridge, since the specific quality of smoke rising above peaks that should not have been smoking. Since the moment the formation had counted to 8 and the 8th number had made the 9th absence into a fact that could not be managed. He could say it. The words were available, his father's silence translated into language, the answer Aragorn was circling without landing on, the thing that needed to be said before they could determine what to do next. He measured the time before he responded. 4 seconds. Aragorn read the 4 seconds the way Aragorn read everything, completely, without missing the weight of what the pause contained. Neither of them said it aloud. They did not need to. The 4 seconds had said it. There was no winning condition in the conventional sense. There was only the question of what could be preserved, and in what order, and for how long. Frodo sat outside the stable door in the gray evening light, with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up and his hand flat against his chest. He was not aware, at a conscious level, that he had been making the gesture continuously for 47 days. The hand against the chest had become involuntary, the way breathing becomes involuntary, the way blinking becomes involuntary, the way any motion becomes involuntary when it is performed with sufficient repetition and sufficient urgency until the body decides to take it over from the mind and run it as a background process. The weight was gone. He had adjusted to the weight's absence the way you adjust to a sound stopping, not by getting used to it, but by becoming, over time, more aware of what you were doing in the silence. He ate. He walked. He spoke when spoken to and sometimes when not. He was functional in every practical measure. What had not returned was the specific quality of his own silence before the ring. The silence of Bag End's evenings, and the Shears fields, and the particular peace of a hobbit who has never been required to carry anything heavier than his own contentment. That silence had a texture he could remember, but could not reconstruct. Something had been taken from it on the bridge that was not the ring itself, something that the ring's presence, over 6 months of carrying, had replaced so completely that its removal left not emptiness, but a different kind of weight. The absence of what had been there, which was worse than simple absence because it had a specific shape. He did not speak about this. There was no language for it that would not require everyone else to stop managing the things that needed managing in order to manage him. And that was not a trade he was prepared to make. He pressed his hand against his chest and watched the sun go down behind Adoris's roofline and counted the smoke columns above the misty mountains, which were visible even at this distance on a clear evening, which this was. There were 6 now. There had been 4 on the 22nd day. Gimli found his way to the stable at the 3rd hour in the manner of someone who had been circling a decision for a while, and had arrived at it. He sat on a feed bucket with the specific economy of a dwarf settling in for a conversation of substance, which meant both hands on his axe haft and his chin level, and he looked at Aragorn in the way that dwarves look at people they are prepared to be honest with. Aragorn asked him the question directly. What is the hottest fire that men can make? Gimli answered without hesitation. This was a dwarf's territory, and dwarves did not hesitate on their own territory. The temperature of a forge's deepest chamber. The specific heat required to smelt mithril, which was the highest standard in dwarven metallurgy, a figure Gimli could express not just as a general magnitude, but with the precision of someone who had stood at that level of heat and understood it in his body. Aragorn told him the shepherd's account. The temperature in the Dimril Dale's lower reaches. The rate of change over 7 days as the columns had widened. The extrapolated figure at the eastern gate's threshold on the day the Nazgul had entered and not exited. Gimli was quiet for 4 seconds. His hands on the axe haft were still. His chin was still level. He was running his own calculation. The dwarven forge master's instinct for heat and material, and what materials could persist in what heats. We need a different question, he said. His voice was even. It was the evenness of someone who has arrived at the same conclusion as everyone else in the room and has decided to confirm that they are all standing on the same ground before anything else is attempted. Aragorn nodded once. They both knew the question. The question was not what the hottest fire that men could make was. The question was what, if anything, the fire that had swallowed the world's most dangerous object could not survive. Neither of them had the answer yet. The stable was quiet. Outside, the 6 smoke columns above the misty mountains held their positions against the darkening sky, patient and continuous and precisely terribly wrong. Saruman had spent 200 years being the cleverest power in any room. This was not vanity. Vanity required insecurity as its foundation, the persistent need to assert a quality whose existence the asserter privately doubted. What Saruman had was something more stable and more dangerous, an accurate assessment. He was, by any measurable standard, the most analytically capable entity west of Mordor. His understanding of ring lore exceeded Gandalf's by the specific margin of 2 centuries of dedicated study conducted without Gandalf's knowledge. His grasp of Middle-earth's political architecture, the tributary relationships between the Rohirrim and Gondor, the fault lines in the Elvish councils. The specific points at which mortal ambition could be redirected by a sufficiently precise application of language was comprehensive in a way that no single mind in the Third Age could match. He had built Isengard into a functioning administrative center for a reason, not because he enjoyed administration. Because administration was how you built a position from which every available future was reachable, and every available future was something Saruman had been tracking simultaneously for decades. He sat in Orthank's upper chamber on the 53rd day with the palantir on its plinth before him, and worked through what he knew. The ring was no longer with Sauron's intended vector. The Hobbit was alive and ringless somewhere south of Rohan. Sauron's military architecture was fragmenting. He had intelligence from 3 sources on the orc migrations out of Mordor, the desertion rates from the Minas Morgul garrison, the specific quality of silence from Barad Doctor that his own contacts in the east had been reporting for 2 weeks. Lothlórien was burning. The Nazgul's formation had a gap in it that his palantir work had confirmed indirectly 3 days ago. He assembled these facts with the precision of a scholar who has spent his career understanding that facts are not themselves conclusions, that the same set of facts, arranged differently, support different conclusions, and the arrangement is where the real work is done. The arrangement he kept returning to was this: the ring's new bearer had no political interest. Sauron had political interest. Sauron wanted dominion, specific, organized, administered dominion. He wanted the rings of power deployed as a governance mechanism, the free peoples brought under a single hierarchical authority, the world organized according to a will that happened to be his. This was a comprehensible ambition. You could negotiate with a comprehensible ambition. You could position yourself within it, find the gap between what the ambition required and what it could supply without assistance, and make yourself the supply. The Balrog wanted nothing of the kind. The Balrog was, as far as the intelligence supported, simply burning west. No governance structure, no administrative apparatus, no hierarchy of subordinates whose ambitions could be mapped and redirected. A less sophisticated mind would have concluded that this made the Balrog a worse problem than Sauron. Saruman concluded the opposite. The Balrog's lack of political interest was not an obstacle. It was a vacancy. Governance of a territory did not require the thing burning through that territory to govern it. It required the territory, and a capable administrator, and a credible claim to the Balrog's tacit tolerance. 3,000 years of observation had taught Saruman one absolute raw power and administrative competence were almost never located in the same entity. Sauron was the exception that proved the rule, and even Sauron had required a mouth, a diplomatic apparatus, a hierarchy of increasingly incompetent subordinates to bridge the gap between his will and its execution. The Balrog had none of these things. The Balrog needed a mouth. Saruman was, among many other qualifications, the finest available candidate for the position. He reached for the palantir. He had used the stone 412 times across 2 centuries. He knew its weight, its temperature, the specific quality of the mental engagement it required, the gathering of will toward a point, the extension of that point outward through the stone's architecture, the controlled focus that allowed you to choose what you reached for rather than simply broadcasting indiscriminately into the network. He had used it to surveil Sauron, to maintain the fiction of his loyalty while conducting his own research. He had used it to monitor Gandalf, to track the Fellowship's departure from Rivendell, to read the strategic situation in real time with an accuracy no other power in the West possessed. He settled his will against the stone's surface and extended. He was prepared for resistance. Any mental engagement through the palantir involved a negotiation of wills. The stone's own architecture was neutral, but whatever awareness you were reaching toward had its own counterpressure, and managing that counterpressure was the discipline the stone required. With Sauron, the counterpressure had been enormous and deliberate. A wall of will that required constant managed opposition from Saruman's side to prevent the engagement from becoming one-directional. He had handled it. The engagement had, across 2 centuries, eroded something in him that he had not fully accounted for, but he had handled it. He was prepared for the Balrog's counterpressure to be larger. He was not prepared for there to be no counterpressure. What arrived through the stone was not resistance. It was not will directed against his will. It was not attention focused on him in the way that Sauron's eye had always, eventually, found and fixed on him during their engagements. It was a view. He had time to understand that the stone had connected. He had time to feel the connection's quality. Not the managed channel he had always constructed with deliberate care, but something that opened the way a window opens onto a landscape that exists whether or not the window is there. The stone had not given him access to the Balrog's awareness. It had given the Balrog's awareness access to him, because the ring that was now the Balrog's fire contained within it the architecture of the Palantri's network, and when Saruman had pressed his will against the stone, he had not reached outward. He had opened a door. The Balrog was not in the stone. It was not looking at him through the stone. It was simply, as a consequence of the ring's seeing power now being the Balrog's fire, aware of the stone, aware of Orthanc, aware of the White Tower and the small pale light that the White Tower contained. The view lasted 47 seconds. It was not crafted. This was the fact that Saruman's mind kept returning to in the first seconds. The analytical habit operating even under conditions the analytical habit had not been designed for. It was not constructed for psychological effect. It was not selected. It was not aimed. It was simply what the Balrog's awareness registered when the stone connected, the way a mirror registers what is in front of it, without making any choices about the quality of the reflection. What the Balrog saw was a white tower, a structure of dressed stone on a raised platform, well engineered, of no particular interest as an architectural object. Inside it, in the upper chamber, a creature of moderate size and moderate heat signature and 2 centuries of accumulated ambition. A creature that had spent 200 years building mechanisms for acquiring power. A creature that had never in 200 years acquired power in any form that was not contingent. Contingent on Sauron's sufficiency. Contingent on Gandalf's blindness. Contingent on the continued structural integrity of a political situation that had now been replaced by geological fire. A scholar of strength. The phrase arrived in Saruman's mind complete. Not from outside, there was nothing outside reaching in, but as the only accurate formulation for what the reflection showed. He had spent 200 years studying strength the way a cartographer studies terrain, comprehensively, accurately, at no point standing on the terrain itself. He knew the topography of power in Middle-earth better than any living entity. He had never, in 200 years, exercised power that was not borrowed from a position he had spent decades constructing by convincing other powers he was useful. The view ended. The stone went dark. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the Palantir chamber's wall. He did not know when he had moved from the standing position at the plinth to the floor. He had no memory of the transition, because the transition had not been a decision, it had been the body finding its own way to a lower center of gravity without consulting the mind, which was occupied. He was physically unharmed. He confirmed this in the first few seconds of awareness with the automatic thoroughness of someone who has spent 2 centuries maintaining his physical form as a functional instrument. Hands, arms, the specific quality of the air reaching his lungs. All nominal. He did not speak. The Palantir on its plinth was cold. Not dormant cold, the temperature of a stone not currently in use. Cold in the absolute sense, the specific temperature of a channel that has been closed from the other end. Gurma Wormtongue found him 3 hours and 20 minutes later. He had been coming to the Palantir chamber at regular intervals since the morning's intelligence had suggested Saruman intended to use the stone. The intervals were professional habit. Gurma had spent a decade reading Saruman's operational patterns, and those patterns included a specific quality of post-engagement behavior that required monitoring. The White Wizard was not, in Gurma's long experience, someone who processed difficulty well in isolation. What he found was outside the range of his monitoring protocols. Saruman was seated on the floor with his back against the wall to the left of the Palantir's plinth. His robes were correctly arranged, a detail that Gurma's eye registered immediately as strange, because it meant the floor sitting had not been a collapse, but a placement. The body settling into position with enough retained awareness to maintain the basic dignities. He was breathing at a normal rate. His eyes were open. He had not moved in 3 hours and 20 minutes. Gurma could tell from the specific quality of stillness. Not the stillness of someone who had recently settled, but the stillness of someone who had arrived at complete absence of impulse to move and had simply remained where the last impulse had deposited him. Gurma looked at the Palantir. He had watched Saruman use it 412 times. He had learned, across those sessions, to read the stone's post-engagement state the way you read the quality of silence after music ends, the specific temperature, the residual quality of whatever light the session had produced, the faint warmth that contact with a powerful will always left in the stone's architecture. The stone was cold. The stone was dark. The stone had the quality of a room the fire has gone out of. Gurma crossed to it. He stood in front of it for 6 seconds. The palantir's surface held nothing. No residual light, no warmth, no suggestion that any engagement had occurred from which something deliberate could be extrapolated. He had, across a decade of service, become accustomed to the stone's post-engagement glow. He had not, until this moment, understood that the glow was Saruman's ambition reflecting back from the surface. There was no ambition in the surface now. He took off his cloak. It was a good cloak, dark wool, well made, the kind of garment that a man who had been a king's chief counselor had access to and maintained with appropriate care. He covered the palantir with it. The stone glowed anyway, cold light through the wool, steady and sourceless and entirely indifferent to the covering. The cloak did nothing. The light came through the fibers with the same quality it would have produced in open air. Gurma stared at it. 6 seconds. He counted them without meaning to. The way you count things when the mind needs something measurable in an environment that has become, in a very short time, comprehensively unmeasurable. He left the chamber. He walked down the stairs of Orthanc without his cloak, into the cold air of Isengard's yard, and he did not stop walking until he reached the outer wall's gate, at which point he stood in the gateway and looked north along the road. The cloak was still up there. On a cold stone, glowing through wool, in a room with a man who had spent 200 years being the cleverest power in any room, and had just, in 47 seconds, run out of room. The mouth of Sauron had held his position for more than 60 years through the consistent application of one principle. He knew what he was worth. Not in the way that ambitious men know their worth, as an aspirational figure, always slightly higher than current circumstances reflected, requiring constant renegotiation upward. In the precise way. He had, over 6 decades of service as the lieutenant of Barad-dûrc, developed an accurate accounting of his value to Sauron's operational apparatus, the specific capabilities he provided that no other instrument in the Dark Lord's inventory could replicate, and the specific capabilities he lacked that he was careful never to overstate. He was not a military commander. He was not a strategist in the pure sense. He was a translator. The mechanism by which Sauron's will was converted from the absolute frequency in which it existed at Barad-dûr into the negotiable language that the free peoples, the client kings, the tributary warlords, and the various terrified intermediaries could receive and act on. The Dark Lord's will, unmediated, was not a thing you gave to a garrison commander. It was not a thing you sent to a border negotiation. It required reduction, framing, the specific craft of presenting absolute authority as something the recipient could process without shutting down entirely. The mouth was that craft, embodied. He rode out of Barad-dûr's western gate on the 61st day with a company of 12 black riders, cavalry, not Nazgul, the distinction being significant, and the specific quality of purposeful movement that characterized all of his operational assessments. Not urgency. Urgency suggested that the situation had exceeded preparation. What he had was schedule, a timeline constructed from the intelligence reports that had been arriving from the western garrisons at decreasing frequency over the past 3 weeks, and a recognition that decreasing frequency required direct verification. The road to Osgiliath was 4 days at a maintained pace. He had made it 11 times. He knew its specific qualities, the way the Morgul Vale's intersection added a particular quality of cold to the air that persisted for 8 miles past the junction, the exact point at which Osgiliath's ruined skyline became visible above the river plain, the smell of the Anduin at the crossing point where Sauron's bridge had stood and the pontoons now served. On the 3rd day, he passed the first abandoned camp. He stopped the company and spent 11 minutes assessing it. The camp was for 400. He established this from the fire pit dimensions. A Mordor cook pit was standardized to a specific size per number of users, a logistics decision made 300 years ago and maintained with the consistency that all Sauron's administrative standards were maintained, which was absolute. 400 users, 16 fire pits. The equipment was present, weapons racked in the formation storage pattern, bedrolls arranged in the specified grid, cookware stacked at the supply point. The orcs were not. He walked the camp's perimeter and looked for signs of attack, the specific forensic signatures of a military engagement which he had learned to read across 6 decades of field assessment. Disturbed earth. Blood, the structural damage that combat produces in arranged spaces. He found none of these. The camp had not been attacked. It had been vacated. Orderly enough to suggest deliberate departure rather than rout. Disorderly enough to suggest the departure had not been planned in advance, the gear left behind was not the gear of troops who knew they were leaving and chose what to carry. It was the gear of troops whose departure had been decided faster than the decision to bring gear could occur. He remounted. He did not speak. His company read his silence correctly and matched it. 2 miles further, a second camp. 800. Empty in the same manner. Osgiliath was a ruin in the specific way that Third-Age Gondor produced ruins. Grandeur whose degradation had been so gradual that the grandeur and the degradation had become indistinguishable. Great stone structures reduced to functional shelter by the subtraction of everything that had made them great. The garrison had held the eastern bank for 11 years under rotating command. He had assessed it 4 times. He knew its specific character, 800 permanent rotating reinforcement of up to 3,000 during active threat periods, supply lines running east along the road he had just traveled. He pulled up on the ridge above the eastern approach and looked at it. He did not immediately count. He made himself look first, to see the whole before the parts. Because the parts could be managed and the whole, if you went directly to the parts, could be missed. The whole was, the garrison was there. The structures were intact. The bridge pontoons were in position. The watchfires at the 4 designated positions were burning. He watched for 4 minutes without the company moving. The watchfires were burning. Nothing moved around them. He rode down. The fires had been burning unattended for approximately 36 hours. He established this from the fuel consumption rate. Mordor's garrison fires used a standardized fuel load, another administrative decision maintained with absolute consistency, and the consumption pattern told you elapsed time the way a candle's length tells you elapsed time. 36 hours since the last tending. The fire at the northern watch point had consumed its load completely and was burning the post itself. Slowly, with the patience of a fire that has run out of the fuel it was given, and has found alternative fuel without any urgency about the distinction. He stood in the garrison's central yard and looked at the numbers. He counted the abandoned fire pits. He counted the weapon racks. He counted the supply manifests he found in the quartermaster's building, which told him the last confirmed inventory count and the date it had been conducted. He counted 3 times. The number was wrong by 4,000. Not dead. Not deployed. Not transferred to a secondary position through the chain of command, because the chain of command would have produced documentation, and the quartermaster's building had documentation for everything up to 18 days ago and nothing after. 4,000 soldiers across 2 weeks had simply ceased to be where they had been without producing a single transfer order, a single chain of command notification, a single piece of administrative evidence that the departure had been organized from above. He stood in the yard with the counts in front of him and made himself be still. This was not a military problem. Military problems had legible shapes: supply failure, command collapse, enemy action, disease. Each of those shapes produced specific forensic signatures, and he had been trained to read them. None of those signatures were present. What was present was absence. Clean, complete, undocumented absence. The absence of 4,000 soldiers who had, by every physical indicator, simply stood up from their positions and walked away from them. He knew what direction they had walked. The orcs of Morgoth's making carried something in their deepest architecture that 3,000 years of Sauron's administrative overlay had not fully replaced. This was not a fact that Sauron's apparatus acknowledged. It was not a thing the mouth of Sauron had ever been briefed on, because it was not a thing that Sauron's administrative structure had a briefing for. The assumption of that structure being, as it had been for 3,000 years, that Morgoth's original patterning was a substrate that Sauron's dominion had long since superseded. The rings had done their work. The Nine had enforced compliance across the Second and Third Ages through mechanisms thorough enough to have produced, in the present day, an orc army whose deepest loyalty to Sauron was indistinguishable from instinct. The assumption was accurate under the conditions it had been designed for. Under the current conditions, the assumption had a gap in it. Sauron's dominion operated through the rings, through the hierarchical chain of 9 to 1 to the 1. The command signal that descended from Barad-dûr through the Nazgul to the orc commanders to the battalions, each link in the chain amplifying and translating the original signal into the register the next level could receive. The chain was robust. It had held across 3,000 years of continuous operation. The chain had a break in it now, and the break was at the 1 ring. What arrived through the remaining chain, through the 8 Nazgûl whose rings still functioned, through the commanders whose authority derived from those rings, through the administrative structure that Sauron had spent ages building, was noise. Not silence, not absence, not the clean gap of a broken circuit. Noise, command-shaped signals arriving without the authority that had previously given those signals their binding quality. Orders that had the form of orders without the force. The orc commanders issued them. The battalions received them. The battalions registered that something had arrived through the expected channel, and that the something lacked the specific quality that had. For 3,000 years made the expected channel's contents non-optional. Below that registration, in the substrate that Sauron's overlay had not fully reached, the Morgoth frequency was broadcasting. It was not a command. It was not a summons. It was not directed. It was simply the oldest signal the orcs' deepest architecture had ever been built to receive. Arriving at a strength and clarity that 3,000 years of successive overwriting had not been able to fully eliminate, now amplified to a magnitude that cut through the overlay the way a forge heat cuts through surface rust, not deliberately, not with any intention of revealing what was underneath, simply by being sufficient. They did not march. Marching implied command. They drifted. The word was Aragorn's, from the shepherd's account he had relayed in the stable at Edoras, and it was accurate. The movement had the quality of drift, of individual organisms responding to a gradient rather than an instruction, each one separately arriving at the same direction without coordination, the collective movement emerging from the individual movements rather than producing them. West, toward the fire. Not to reach it, they had no concept of reaching it. Simply toward it, the way iron filings orient toward a magnet without having a destination. In Bered Doctor the eye was still. It had been still for 6 days. Not in the way the eye was still during patient surveillance, that stillness had a quality of focused intention. The compression of enormous will toward a specific point. This stillness was different. It was the stillness of a calculating mind that had reached, across 6 days of continuous assessment, the boundary of what its calculations could address. Sauron had spent 3 ages building an empire around a single instrument. The instrument had been perfect for its purpose. The most precisely engineered tool for dominion that the world had ever produced, designed to his exact specifications, calibrated to his exact nature, an extension of his will given material form. He had poured the greater part of himself into it. Not as sacrifice, as investment, the long strategic commitment of a mind that thought in ages. That could sustain 3,000 years of preparation for a single moment of recovery, that had never once questioned whether the investment was sound. The instrument was now amplifying a will that was not his. The thought arrived with the specific quality of a thing that had been arriving for 6 days, and had finally reached the level of acknowledgement that his mind's architecture required before it could be processed as a fact, rather than a contingency. He had been, for 6 days, treating it as a contingency. Running the calculations of what remained available, what leverage, what alternative mechanisms, what portion of the empire's structure could function independently of the ring's central authority. The calculations had produced, across 6 days, the same result. Below the calculations, too deep to be called a thought, too present to be refused, something else arrived. Not grief, not despair, something colder and more precise. Morgoth would find this satisfying. The sentence was complete. It had no source he could locate. It simply existed in his awareness the way accurate things exist, not arrived at through reasoning, not constructed from evidence, simply true and therefore present. He had built an empire for 3 ages. He had poured his power into an instrument of absolute control. The instrument had found its way into the fire of a Maia who had served the architect of everything Sauron had ever built, who had watched Sauron take that architecture and make it his own, who had slept for 5,000 years in the roots of the world and woken carrying the ring by accident, without intention, without plan. Without plan. The recognition had a specific quality. He had spent 3 ages building plans. The thing that had undone 3 ages of plans had no plan at all. He could not make the sentence leave. The sun had not been visible from Edoras in 11 days. Not obscured in the way of cloud cover produced a diffuse brightness, a general lightening of the sky that told you the sun was present on the far side of an obstacle. What sat above Rohan now was different in kind. The ash layer at altitude was continuous and of sufficient density to reduce the available light to a flat gray that had no direction. No east, no west, no angle from which the sun could be inferred. The sky was the same color at midday as at dawn. Shadow had become irrelevant as a concept because shadow required a light source with a position. Théoden stood on the Mediceld's eastern porch at the 3rd hour of the morning and looked at the sky and said nothing for 4 minutes. He was 71 years old. He had ruled Rohan for 39 of those years, had inherited a kingdom in reasonable order, had maintained it, had understood its specific character well enough to know what it required and what it could provide. Rohan was a kingdom built around movement. The Rohirrim's military doctrine, their economy, their entire cultural self-understanding were organized around the horse and the open ground and the particular freedom of a people who could be anywhere in their territory within 3 days. The sky above them was not a tactical consideration. It was a condition. The Riddermark's famous visibility, the 40-mile sight lines across the Pelennors approach, the way the Eastfold's plains let you see trouble arriving with sufficient lead time to respond, was not a strategic advantage they had cultivated. It was the permanent character of the land. The ash layer had been building for 9 days. It had reached current density on the 6th day and had not thinned since. The deposits on the Mediceld's roof were 4 inches in the corners where the wind collected it. On the open plain east of Edoras, where the wind had no corners to work with, the surface layer was 12 inches deep and compacting. 12 inches was not militarily significant as an obstacle. 24 inches was. 36 inches was the point at which a horse carrying a rider moved through it at half speed rather than 3/4 speed, and at half speed the Rohirrim's doctrine became a memory of itself rather than a functional military capability. He could extrapolate the rate. He had been extrapolating the rate for 3 days. The council met at dawn, or what passed for dawn, the flat gray lightning by 2 degrees of intensity. That was how morning announced itself now. Omer was present. Owen was present. The Marshal of the Eastmark and the 2 surviving Ord's captains were present. The Edoras garrison commander was present. They stood around the great table in the Mediceld's hall and looked at the maps, which had been accurate representations of the Riddermark's terrain for 60 years, and were now representations of a terrain that no longer existed in precisely the form the maps described. Théoden looked at them in turn. Not the maps. The faces. He had been reading the faces of his commanders for 39 years. He knew what readiness looked like on a Rohirrim officer's face, and what confusion looked like, and what the specific quality of professional competence operating outside its design parameters looked like. The face of a man who is thoroughly trained for a situation and is standing in a situation for which the training provides partial coverage at best. He saw that last expression on every face at the table. He did not make them speak first. "We leave tomorrow," he said. "Everything that can be carried in 4 hours. The horses go first." 7 words. The room received them with the specific quality of reception that good orders receive from good soldiers. Not relief, not objection, simply the immediate redirection of attention from the problem to the response. Within 3 seconds of the sentence's completion, the marshal was already thinking about column formation, and Omer was already thinking about the rear guard, and the garrison commander was already thinking about supply weight versus speed ratios. This was what Théoden had built over 39 years. Not an army. A culture that turned decisions into movement without friction loss. He turned back to the maps without ceremony. The evacuation of Edoras began before the gray light had reached its midday intensity. It did not look like an evacuation in the panicked sense. It had the quality of a people performing a task they had not done before, but had, in some structural sense, always been prepared to do, a culture on horseback understanding departure the way a culture on water understands tides. The horses went first, as ordered. The supply wagons followed in the formation the garrison commander had organized in the 3 hours between the council's end and the evacuation's beginning. The civilians moved in the columns that the Ords flanked, maintaining pace without being driven to it. Théoden rode at the column center. Not the head. The head was for the outriders and the scouts. Not the rear was for the guard. The center was where the column's commander rode, when the purpose of the ride was not engagement, but continuation. He did not look back at the Mediceld as the column moved west. He had looked at it during the 3 hours between the council and the evacuation, had stood in its hall, and let himself be present in it with the attention of a man who understands that attention paid now is the available substitute for return. He had given it the time it was owed. The ride required different attention. He looked west and rode. The Balrog crossed into Rohan's eastern reaches on the 72nd day. It came through the gap between the Emyn Muil's southern spur and the Anduin's western bank. not the Gap of Rohan in the northwest. Not the route a military force would select, simply the direction its movement had been trending since Lothlórien and the gap that direction encountered. It was not navigating. It was moving the way magma moves, toward lower pressure, along the path that the geography of resistance produced, without resistance being its concern. The eastern Riddermark's plains absorbed its passage with the silence of a landscape that had already been diminished by 9 days of ashfall, and had, in a sense, been preparing for the next reduction without knowing what form it would take. The form it took was light. The Balrog's fire was visible in the ash dark across a distance that the ash dark should have prevented. The ash reduced visibility in every other respect, obscured the horizon, compressed the sightlines, turned the 40-mile views of the Pelennor approach into gray walls at 100 yards. But the Balrog's fire was not a reflective object seen by ambient light. It was its own source. In the ash dark it read as a second sun, low on the eastern horizon, moving west at a pace that was slower than it looked, because the scale reference points, trees, hills, the farmstead silhouettes along the eastern road, had been reduced to gray suggestions by the ash between here and there. 40 miles. On a clear day, Edoras was visible from 40 miles east. The Balrog was visible from 40 miles in any condition. The outrider was posted on the ridge 6 miles east of Edoras, designated Last Rider. The role existed in Rohirrim doctrine for exactly this situation, the final confirmed intelligence of the threat's position and direction, delivered by the last person to maintain visual contact before the column's safety margin closed. He was 24 years old. He had been a rider for 6 years and an outrider for 2. Selected for the role by the specific qualities it required: geographic memory, accurate speed estimation, and the discipline to stay in position until the intelligence was complete, rather than leaving when the situation became uncomfortable. He had been trained to count. Distances, speeds, force sizes, the measurable dimensions of tactical situations, counting was the outrider's primary instrument. What you brought back to the marshal was not impression. It was numbers. He watched the fire moving through the gray plain from 6 miles away and began his count. Force volume first. He had reference points for this. Standard estimations developed for assessing Mordor army sizes at distance. He began with the fire's lateral spread at ground level, which gave him a base dimension to work with. He had a number in 4 seconds. It was wrong. He counted again. The second count matched the first. He moved to the vertical dimension, the fire's height above the plain, measured against the farmstead roof at the 2-mile mark that was still visible as a gray shape through the ash. He had the farmstead's height in his memory, 16 feet at the ridgeline, a large structure, the Eastfold's biggest grain farm. He used it as his scale reference. He got 3 numbers into the calculation. He stopped, not because the numbers were wrong, because the numbers were right, and the numbers, followed to their conclusion, produced a figure that was not in any range his training had given him reference points for. He had been trained to count what could be counted and report it. He had never been trained for the specific situation in which accurate counting produced a result that was outside the counting system's designed range. He turned his horse. He did not finish the calculation. He did not look back. The intelligence he was carrying was not a number. Numbers required a system to interpret them, and the system he had been given had a ceiling, and what he had seen was above the ceiling. What he was carrying back to the marshal was something simpler and more complete. The direction, the rate of movement, and the specific quality of having begun a count and stopped it, which was itself a number of a kind, not a measurement of what was there, but an accurate report of what the measurement system could not hold. He rode west. He did not count again for the rest of the day, and the omission was its own answer, and the marshal. When the outrider arrived at the column's rear and delivered his report in the flat, efficient register of a man who has performed his function completely, read the omission before the words, and understood that what was behind them on the eastern plain was not a thing that numbers, in their current form, were large enough to address. The Meduseld stood empty in the ash dark. The Balrog passed within visual range at the late afternoon's gray midpoint, close enough that the heat from its passage softened the snow packed against the thatching's northern edge, which had been there for 3 weeks. The snow ran in thin streams along the eaves and dripped from the corners and dried before it reached the ground in the specific way that water dries in radiant heat rather than air temperature. The hall was not touched. Its great doors were closed. Its pillars stood. The golden roof, invisible under ash deposits from above. heated to a dull glow from the fire's proximity and then cooling again as the fire moved west, was intact in every structural detail. The Balrog did not slow. It moved through the Rittermark the way it had moved through Lothlórien, not because it had chosen Rohan specifically, not because the Meduseld represented something it wished to reduce, but because west was the direction, and Rohan was west, and the Rittermark was what west contained. Behind it, the ash settled on the Meduseld's golden roof, in the silence of a landscape that had been many things across 3,000 years, and was now, in the particular stillness of the Balrog's passage, simply quiet. 1,000 years from now, scholars would find it intact under 12 feet of deposit, every timber preserved, every fitting in place, the great table still set as though the council that had met around it had stepped away for an hour and intended to return. They would not know what had walked past it. The mouth of Sauron reached the Black Gate on the 89th day, riding east from Osgiliath, with the news that the eastern armies had dissolved. He had spent 11 days assembling the intelligence into a form that could be delivered. Not because the facts were difficult to gather. The facts were everywhere, written in empty camps and abandoned supply lines, and the specific quality of silence that a military apparatus produces when its 4,000 moving parts have, without coordination, stopped moving. The facts were abundant. What took 11 days was the work of arranging them into a report that was accurate without being. In its structure, an argument for a conclusion that Sauron had already reached through the eye's own surveillance. The mouth was, above all things, precise about his function. He was a translator. He converted the raw material of intelligence into the register his master could use. He did not editorialize. He did not provide context that the most powerful surveilling mind in Middle-earth did not require. He provided the clean fact in the clean form, and the form this report required was one that acknowledged what the eye had already seen while adding what the eye could not see. The ground-level forensic details, the specific texture of the abandonment, the quality of the garrison commanders' faces in the moments before they too had turned west and walked. He had it ready by the 88th day. He rode east on the 89th. The Black Gate was built to be impregnable from the outside. This was not a design flaw. It was a design philosophy. Sauron had built the Morannon to address one specific problem: the prevention of entry into Mordor by forces hostile to his purposes, and he had addressed it completely. The gate's stone was 40 feet thick at the base. Its towers were staffed for a garrison of 600. The approaches were bare rock for 3 miles in every direction, offering no cover, no blind angles, no approach path that did not cross open ground under direct fire from the battlements. It had held against everything the Third Age had sent against it. The mouth of Sauron rounded the final approach road's bend in the gray ash light of the 89th day's mid-morning and stopped his horse. The gate was not there, not fallen, not breached in the sense of having been broken. Breach implied an impact, a force applied from outside, the structural failure that results when a defensive architecture is stressed beyond its tolerances. What he was looking at was not structural failure. The gap where the Morannon had stood glowed red along its edges, the specific red of stone in the process of returning to its pre-solid state. The foundations, 40 feet of dressed stone anchored into Mordor's bedrock, were present as a border of cooling material that had been vertical 4 hours ago and was now the rim of a path. Not an opening, not a doorway. The gate had not been opened. The gate had been removed from the category of things that the concept of open and closed applied to. The Balrog was 40 yards ahead of him on the road to Barad-dûr. He had not seen it at road level before. He had seen the smoke columns above Moria from the intelligence reports, had processed the accounts from the Rohan outriders, had read the Lothlórien dispatches with the cold precision of a man who was paid to convert horror into operational data. None of that had been this. This was the specific difference between the measured dimensions of a thing and the thing in front of you at 40 yards. He opened his mouth. 6 decades of service had produced in him a comprehensive catalog of the language of power. The formal registers, the address forms, the opening sentences that established position and purpose, and the specific quality of authority that made the person you were speaking to understand that this conversation was one they were going to have. He had spoken to kings, to warlords, to the Fellowship's representative at the Black Gate. He had never found a room he could not enter with language. His horse died beneath him before the sentence arrived. Not attacked. Not burned. The horse simply stopped. The cessation of a biological system whose operating temperature range had a ceiling, and the ceiling had been reached in the 8 seconds since they had rounded the bend. The horse stopped the way a watch stops near certain magnets, the machinery intact and the animating condition gone. The mouth of Sauron was on the road with a dead horse before he had processed the horse's stopping. The Balrog passed him without acknowledgement, not contempt, not the deliberate withholding of recognition that power uses as a weapon, simply the absence of registration. The way fire passes a stone, not ignoring it, not choosing to leave it intact, simply moving in its direction without the stone being the relevant variable. The road temperature was still rising. He could feel it through the soles of his boots, which were beginning to exhibit the specific quality of material that has been asked to perform outside its specifications. He looked at the Balrog's receding fire on the road to Barad-dûm. He was the mouth of Sauron. He had spent 6 decades as the voice of the most terrible power in the world, and that power had required a voice because power without articulation was force without direction, and force without direction was geology rather than governance. He had been the difference between Sauron's will and Sauron's administration, the mechanism by which the absolute was made legible. He calculated the angle for 6 seconds. There was no angle. He arrived at this conclusion with the same precision he brought to every calculation, because the calculation was honest, and the honest calculation had one result. There was no position to take. There was no function he could perform for a being that was not building anything, not administering anything, not requiring the conversion of its will into legible form because its will was fire, and fire did not require translation. The mouth of Sauron's entire value proposition rested on the existence of a gap between raw power and its administration. The gap had ceased to exist. He began walking west. He did not look back. He did not, for the first time in 6 decades, have a plan. The 8 Nazgul flew formation out of the Efeldath at the 91st day's dawn. The Witch King flew point. He had flown point on every formation sortie in 3,000 years of service, because the Witch King's position was always the position of first contact, the tip of Sauron's military will as it expressed itself in directed force. Point required the specific combination of tactical reading and absolute authority that only the greatest of the 9 possessed in sufficient measure. He had never ceded the position. He did not cede it now. The formation flew in the configuration for maximum combined terror, the geometry that expressed the 9's full psychological weight as a single instrument. The approach pattern that had broken siege lines and routed cavalry and produced the specific paralysis in mortal forces that the Black Breath achieved at its most effective. They carried no hope. The Witch King had not carried hope since the Third Age's first century, when the last remnant of what he had been before the ring had finally dissolved into what the ring required him to be. He did not mourn the hope's absence. Hope was a mortal instrument, and he had not been mortal for 3,000 years. What he carried was obligation. The obligation of his nature, the 3,000 years of absolute service that had become, through sufficient duration, indistinguishable from identity. He was the Witch King of Angmar. He was the greatest of the 9. He had been made to protect the ring, and the ring was the threat, and the logical impossibility of that combination had no authority over the obligation that produced it. He flew anyway. The way you fulfill a function that has become your entire existence, not because the outcome is achievable, but because the function is what you are, and ceasing to perform it is the only alternative, and that alternative is not available. The formation reached the Morannon's approach at the 91st day's mid-morning, and the Witch King saw the gap where the gate had stood and flew through it without slowing. Below them the road to Barad-dûm was empty except for the cooling residue of the Balrog's passage, which had reduced the road's surface to a black glass that reflected the gray ash sky in the flat way of a mirror that has been heated past the point of useful reflection. The Balrog was at Barad-dûm's western wall. The Witch King descended toward it at formation speed. He had 11 seconds. He had calculated this before the descent began, in the 2 seconds between the Morannon's gap and the formation's commitment to the approach angle. The calculation was accurate. He had been performing accurate calculations for 3,000 years. He used the 11 seconds with the discipline of a mind that had, across 30 centuries of absolute service, developed an absolute economy of attention. No second wasted on what could not be changed. No attention diverted to the gap in the formation that was still, structurally, present, the 9th position, empty since the Moria corridor, a gap his formation sense felt the way a body feels the absence of a limb. No thought given to Sauron. Sauron was behind them, and whatever Sauron was now was behind them, and the 11 seconds were not for that. The 11 seconds were for this, the understanding of what was happening at the precise level it was actually happening, without the mediation of hope or the softening of denial. He was the Witch King of Angmar. He had been a king before the ring, and the ring had made him something larger and less human and more absolute. And that thing had served 3,000 years, and the 3,000 years were ending in 11 seconds, not because he had failed in his function, but because his function had been made by the same hand that had made the thing he was flying toward. And the hand was gone. And the things it had made were resolving their contradictions in the only way contradictions ultimately resolved. 8 wraith lights extinguished in 9 seconds. The Witch King took 2 seconds longer. A Gondorian scout on the Efeldath's southern ridge had been watching since the formation's descent, cataloging with the professional precision of a man who understood that what he was witnessing would require an accurate account. He watched 8 lights go in 9 seconds and noted it. He watched the 9th light persist for 2 additional seconds and noted that. He was a thorough man, and he noted everything, including the specific quality of the 9th light's end, which was not the extinguishing of the first 8. The abrupt cessation of a burning thing stopped from outside. The 9th light went out the way a candle goes out when the wax is finished, not stopped, not extinguished, not acted upon, simply completed. The condition that had sustained it had reached its natural end, and the light, having burned for exactly as long as the condition lasted, stopped burning when the condition stopped. The scout wrote it down in those terms, 40 years later, because those were the accurate terms. He had been trained to report what he saw rather than what he felt about what he saw, and what he saw was completion. Barad-dûr did not fall. The tower had been built as a housing for the ring's power, and the ring's power was now walking through its western gate, and the tower's fundamental architecture, which had always been an expression of the ring's nature made in stone, responded to the new occupancy the way stone responds to sufficient heat, by becoming something other than stone. The lower levels reorganized over 3 days, not demolished. Reorganized, the corridors filled with heat that the stone conducted into the walls and the walls conducted outward, the tower's material expression shifting from the cold administrative architecture of a bureaucratic empire towards something older and less structured. Volcanic glass replacing dressed stone. The corridor's geometry becoming approximate rather than precise. The angles of a building designed for governance softening into the angles of a place designed for nothing, which is to say, existing rather than functioning. The eye at Barad-dûr's pinnacle had burned since Sauron reasserted his form in the Second Age's final century. A fixed point in Middle-earth's darkness, not metaphorical light, not symbolic, but actual luminosity. The seeing fire of the ring's maker focused outward across his territory in continuous surveillance. It had been visible from the Emyn on a clear night for 3,000 years. It had been visible from Minas Tirith's upper levels. The Rohirrim knew it from the Eastamnet on winter nights when the wind came from the east, and the air was clear enough to carry its specific red quality above the Efeldath's ridgeline. It dimmed at the 91st day's mid-afternoon. Not suddenly, not with the drama of a light being extinguished by force. It dimmed the way a fire dims when the fuel begins to fail. Gradual, measurable. A light that had been constant becoming variable, becoming uncertain, becoming absent. It flickered. Twice, the Gondorian scout on the ridge documented both flickers with timestamps. Then it went dark. The Efeldath above it was unchanged. The ash clouds were unchanged. The gray sky that had replaced Rohan's open blue was unchanged. But the specific quality of darkness above Mordor's mountains was different from that point, not the darkness that exists in opposition to a light that is still burning somewhere behind it. Simply darkness. The ordinary darkness of a sky at which nothing is looking. Sauron did not roar. He did not speak. He did not produce any signal that could be measured or recorded by the scout on the ridge or anyone else in a position to observe. He dispersed in the way that a scent disperses. Not destroyed. Not imprisoned. Not contained. Present in decreasing concentration across the air and rock of the territory he had ruled for 3 ages, thinning from the center outward. Settling into the geology the way a dye settles into water, present everywhere in insufficient concentration to cohere, available to no instrument sensitive enough to locate, leaving in the mineralogy of Mordor's soil the specific chemical signature of a will that had been here and had become indistinguishable from here. Not gone, simply no longer the kind of thing that could be found. Sauron's last coherent act was comprehension, not defiance. The histories of the Second Age were full of Sauron's defiance. the specific quality of a will that had survived the drowning of Menor, the destruction of his physical form, 3,000 years of reduced capacity operating below his nature's full register, always rebuilding, always patient, always certain that the next age would restore what the current age had taken. Defiance was the instrument of a mind that believed the current situation was temporary. What arrived in Barad Doctor's upper chamber in the 91st day's final hour was not defiance, because the mind producing it was performing, for the first time in its existence, a calculation whose result it could not adjust through patience or preparation or the long strategic commitment to outcomes measured in ages rather than years. The calculation was simple. It had 4 elements. He had poured the greater part of his native power into the ring. This was the investment, the foundational strategic commitment from which every subsequent decision of the second and third ages had proceeded. The ring was not simply a weapon or a tool. It was the anchor of his self, the material housing of the portion of his will that exceeded his current form's capacity to contain. Without the ring he was diminished. With it, he was complete. The ring was now inside the fire moving through Barad Doctor's western gate. The fire was a Maia whose native power, even before the ring's amplification, was not smaller than his own diminished form. They were of the same order in the hierarchy of the Ainur. They had been so when both served Morgoth. They were so now, except that one of them contained the portion of the other's self that made the other complete, and the one who contained it was not him. The ring's inherent loyalty was to its maker. This was the architecture of its forging, the mechanism by which it had always eventually worked its way back toward Barad Doctor. Passing through a handful of bearers in the long chain from Isildur to Frodo across the years of the Third Age, it had always been moving home. The loyalty was structural, not passive. It was built into the ring's fundamental nature. The fire had been carrying the ring for 76 days. 76 days against 3,000 years of Sauron's administrative overlay of the Orc army's loyalty. He had seen what 76 days had done to that overlay. He understood the rate of change. The loyalty was still there. It was simply no longer sufficient, because the ring's loyalty to its maker was a pull, and the Balrog's fire was a gravity, and gravity and pull were not the same category of force. He understood this completely in the 4 seconds before the fire reached Barad Doctor's lower foundations. He understood that he had built an empire for someone else. Every stone of Barad Doctor, every enslaved will across 3 ages, every century of patient reconstruction after each defeat. The ring he had forged as the instrument of his absolute dominion was now amplifying a Maia who had not asked for it and did not know what to do with it, and would not have wanted it if offered, and had acquired it through a whip's reflex in a falling moment and did not care about any of what he had built, not one stone of it, not one enslaved will, not the 3 ages of patience, not the long dream of restored power. Did not care. That was the specific element the calculation kept returning to. Not opposed, not hostile, not driven by revenge or ideology or the counter-will of an enemy who had reasons for everything they did. Simply indifferent. The empire had been built in the path of something indifferent to it, and indifference was the one thing his architecture had no response for. He had spent 3 ages preparing for enemies. He had not prepared for weather. The tower reorganized around the fire over 3 days. Not demolished. The architecture was too fundamental for demolition. Barad Doctor had been built as an extension of the ring's power expressed in stone, and the ring was present. And the stone responded to the ring's presence the way it always had, by becoming the most complete expression of what the ring currently was. What the ring currently was had changed. The stone changed accordingly. The lower levels went first. The corridors of the administrative apparatus, the chambers where the mouth of Sauron had drafted his communications, the records rooms where 3 ages of intelligence were housed, the garrison spaces, the interrogation cells with their specific and comprehensive architecture, their geometry became approximate over 72 hours. Not destroyed. Approximated, the precision of their angles softened as the stone's crystalline structure responded to sustained heat from below, the 90-degree corners becoming 87 degrees, then 83, then curves that retained the suggestion of right angles without committing to them. The volcanic glass spread upward through the walls from the foundations, replacing dressed stone at a rate of 4 feet per day. The records dissolved not through fire but through temperature, the papyrus and vellum of 3 ages of documentation reaching their thermal limit and becoming in sequence brittle, then ash, then nothing. 3 ages of intelligence. the locations of every remaining elvish stronghold, the composition of every mortal army, the ring lore that Sauron had accumulated over 6,000 years of study. The ash of it mixed with the volcanic glass in the wall material and became part of the tower's new composition. The eye had been dark for 4 hours when the silence reached the orc armies. It arrived at different times in different positions. The battalions closest to Barad-dûr felt it first. The ones at the Empire's outer edges last, but the quality of arrival was the same across the full breadth of Mordor and the surrounding territories where Sauron's forces had been distributed. It was not a signal, it was the cessation of a signal, the constant low-frequency pressure that had been the background condition of every orc's existence. The permanent atmospheric presence of Sauron's will, operating below the threshold of conscious registration but above the threshold of biological effect, went quiet. The battalions, still in formation from orders given 12 hours ago, stood in the silence for varying lengths of time. The shortest was 4 minutes, a garrison unit on the Efeldath's inner slope, whose commander had been in the middle of issuing a repositioning order when the silence arrived, and whose soldiers' cessation of movement had been so complete and so simultaneous that the commander had stopped mid-sentence and looked at them and then turned in the direction of Barad-dûr and stood with his back to his soldiers for 11 minutes before anyone moved again. The longest was 1 hour and 40 minutes. A unit of 300 on the Nirn's southern shore, who had been running supply operations for the agriculture that fed Mordor's slave population. A function so embedded in daily routine that the silence's arrival had taken longer to register against the background of activity. When it registered, they stopped. All 300, across 6 separate work sites, within 40 seconds of each other. They stood in the silence for 1 hour and 40 minutes. No one gave an order. No one received one. The chain that had produced and transmitted orders for 3,000 years had nothing moving through it. The commanders had no instruction to pass down. The soldiers had no instruction to receive. The absence of instruction was, in itself, a condition none of them had a behavioral response for, not in the way that hunger had a behavioral response, or cold, or the presence of an enemy. The absence of instruction from above was simply a state that had not existed before and for which no instinct had been developed. What developed, in the absence of instinct, in the silence where Sauron's will had been, was something that arrived from further down, from the layer below Sauron's overlay, below the 3,000 years of administrative patterning. Morgoth's baseline, briefly uncovered. Not a directive, not a command. Simply the specific quality of existing without being anyone's instrument. Surfacing for the first time in the orcs' collective experience of being alive. The word, had any of them possessed it, was freedom. None of them possessed it. The concept existed in languages they did not speak, in the experience of peoples whose history was not theirs. They had no vocabulary for the sensation of the compulsion's absence, and no framework in which to understand what they were feeling as something that had a name and a value. They stood in it for 6 hours. The eastern wind came at the 6th hour's end. Not wind in the atmospheric sense. The ash layer above Mordor was producing its own weather patterns. The thermal activity of the volcanic transformation generating pressure differentials that moved air in directions that had nothing to do with the prevailing regional climate. The wind that came from the east was warm in the specific way that the Balrog's amplified presence produced warmth. Not the warmth of temperature as a condition, but warmth as a signal. The frequency of the First Age's authority arriving on the air the way a scent arrives, not directed, not aimed, simply present as a property of the medium it was moving through. Sauron's overlay had been a ceiling. It had pressed down from above, organized, administrative, the governance of a mind that thought in structures and hierarchies and chains of command. The Balrog's resonance was not a ceiling. It was a floor. It did not press from above. It saturated from below, filling the substrate that Sauron's departure had left empty, settling into the Morgoth baseline the way water settles into the lowest available space. The freedom lasted exactly 6 hours and 14 minutes. Then it ended, and what replaced it was older and less structured and did not have the administrative character of Sauron's governance. No commands, no hierarchy, no chain of translation from will to execution. Only the resonance. The orientation. The Morgoth frequency amplified past the point of ignoring. The battalions began to move. One orc did not move. It was on the Nirn's southern shore, part of the 300 unit that had been standing for 1 hour and 40 minutes before the silence arrived, and then for the 6 hours after. It was not a commander. It was not, by any measure, the Mordor military apparatus used for such assessments, remarkable in any direction. It had been alive for 40 years, which was middle-aged for its kind, and had spent those 40 years in the supply function because it was large enough for physical labor and not aggressive enough for combat assignments, and had survived the assessments that determined such things. When the others began to move, it sat down, not in resistance, not in any act that could be called decision. Simply, at the moment when the orientation arrived and the direction clarified, and the instinct that told it to rise and move engaged, something else engaged at the same moment. The 6 hours of silence had left a residue, not understanding, not vocabulary, simply a pattern in its nervous system for the specific quality of the past 6 hours, the specific texture of existing without the pressure from above. The pattern was new. It was 6 hours old, which was the youngest thing in its 40 years of experience. But it was there. It sat on the shore of the Nirn with the ash coming down around it in the flat gray quality of the 91st day's evening light, and looked at its hands. The others moved past it. No one stopped. No one looked at it. It sat there with the eastern wind carrying the Balrog's resonance across the water toward it, and the resonance was large, and it was getting larger, and the specific quality of what the next hours would require was not unclear. It sat there anyway, looking at its hands. The ash settling on its shoulders. The wind changed. It did not sit there after the wind changed. But for the time between the others leaving and the wind's second coming, a duration of 9 minutes, measured afterward by the tracks in the ash that told you where it had sat and how long the ash had settled on the impression before the movement disturbed it. For 9 minutes, in the flat gray light of a Mordor with no eye above it, and no voice below it, and nothing in the space between them but the specific weight of being nothing's instrument, a single orc sat on the shore of an inland sea and looked at its hands and had no orders, and no instinct to fill the silence, and nothing to be but present in the only 9 minutes of its 40 years that belonged entirely to itself. Gandalf the White had been thinking about Frodo's hands for 4 months, not continuously. The thinking was the kind that happened in the margins of other thinking, present while he was working through the tactical assessments, present while he was in council with Aragorn and Legolas, present in the pre-dawn hours of the camps between Edoras and the Efeldath's western approach, when the rest of the company slept, and he sat with his staff across his knees and watched the ash-dark sky produce its flat gray light without a sun behind it. It was the thinking of a specific hypothesis, turning over, being tested against new information as it arrived, never being fully confirmed but never being disconfirmed either. The hypothesis was this: the ring's domination mechanism operated through awareness. It found its bearers, extended its influence into them, located the specific quality of their desire and redirected it. This required perceiving them. The ring's seeing power was not metaphorical but architectural, built into the same forging that had produced the fire letters and the resizing and the invisibility effect. The ring saw its bearers. This was how it had slipped from finger to finger across the long years, not randomly, but directionally, always moving toward the bearer that its awareness assessed as the most viable path back to Barad Doctor. The ring could not see Frodo. Gandalf had arrived at this conclusion on the 31st day, and he had spent the subsequent 91 days testing it against the available evidence, with the rigor of a mind that had spent 2,000 years learning to distinguish between what was confirmed and what was wished for. The evidence held. In 6 months of carrying, Frodo had not been consumed. He had been diminished, had been marked, had been changed in ways that would not fully reverse. But the ring had not enslaved him. It had not redirected his desire toward Barad Doctor. It had not, in the end, done to Frodo what it had done to the 9 men, what it had done to Gollum across 5 centuries. The resistance had created something. Not simply the absence of domination, something structural, a negative space in the ring's awareness where Frodo should have been and was not. The ring had failed to perceive Frodo completely enough to enslave him, and that failure had left a gap in its architecture. The ring was now the Balrog's fire, which meant the gap was in the Balrog's awareness of the world. He told them on the 93rd day, in a camp at the Efeldath's western base, in the specific quality of silence that arrives when 5 people have been traveling together long enough to have dispensed with everything except the necessary. He told them the mission logic first. Not because the logic required extensive argument. Aragorn had arrived at most of it independently, and Legolas had been watching Gandalf arrive at the rest of it for 3 months with the patience of someone waiting for a calculation to complete. but because the logic needed to be shared before the rest could be built on top of it. The ring was fused with the Balrog. The ring could only be unmade in the fire that made it. The Balrog was 14 miles from Ord-Ruin. The Balrog was not going to Ord-Ruin. The mountain would have to receive what the mountain had made by some other mechanism. He told them what he carried. The Flame of Anor, not a spell, not a weapon in any form that the word weapon had been applied to in the Third Age's military history. The secret fire of Ilúvatar, which was the creative fire underlying the physical world's existence, of which Ord-Ruin's volcanic function was one expression among many. He was the servant of the secret fire. He had carried it from the moment of his sending, had carried it across 2,000 years of Middle-earth, and across the Bridge of Khazad-dûm and through the long fall into the deep water, and up through Xiraxagil's snow, and back into the world as Gandalf the White. It was not something he could use as a weapon. It was something he could use as a key, an authorization, presented to Ord-Ruin's geological pressure in the language that pressure would recognize, giving the mountain the specific permission it had been waiting 3 ages to receive. The mountain wanted to collapse. Volcanoes in the presence of sufficient seismic loading always want to collapse. What prevented them was the geological resistance of surrounding structures, the cumulative weight of the mountain's own mass, providing the counter-pressure that kept the internal pressure from expressing itself. If the internal pressure were sufficient, and if the counter-pressure were removed at a specific structural point, the collapse would be self-sustaining. It would require no continuation from him, it would only require initiation. He needed 60 yards from Barad-dûr's outer wall, and he needed 4 seconds. Frodo listened without speaking until the end. Then he said, "The ring cannot see me." "No," said Gandalf, "it cannot." Frodo looked at the fire between them for 7 seconds. It was a small fire, adequate for the camp's purpose, built with the economy of people who had been rationing fuel for 3 weeks and knew the difference between sufficient heat and excessive heat. He had, Gandalf noted, not touched his chest during the explanation. The involuntary gesture had been present in every camp since the bridge, regular as breathing. The body's habitual reaching for an object that was no longer there. It was absent now. Something in the explanation had replaced the habit with attention. "You need me at the crack of doom," said Frodo. "Not to carry anything. To stand there," said Gandalf. "The stone at the edge of the chasm knows the ring. The ring is the Balrog's awareness of the world. When the stone recognizes you, when the awareness that the ring carries of its own making place passes through the stone and finds a bearer the ring has already failed to fully perceive, the recognition will travel in both directions, simultaneously." Frodo understood this in the way that hobbits understood things that were completely outside their experience. By finding the part of it that was familiar and standing on that part. "It will look at me," he said. "It will look at you," said Gandalf, "and it will look at the mountain, at the same moment. And the mountain will be looking back." Frodo was quiet for 4 seconds, and then the mountain falls, and then the mountain falls. Frodo looked at the fire again. "On me," he said. Yes, the fire was the same fire it had been before the word yes. The camp was the same camp. The flat gray sky above the Ifildath was the same sky. Frodo sat in it with the specific quality of someone who has just received information that does not change anything they have already decided, only fills in the dimension of it that they had not yet been shown. "All right," said Frodo. They entered Mordor on the 95th day through a pass in the Ifildath that Aragorn had identified from the maps. Not a military pass, not a route that appeared in any tactical assessment of Mordor's entry points. A shepherd's path from the Third Age's early centuries, before Mordor had become what Mordor had become, when the land had still been traversable by people with animals and moderate determination. The gate infrastructure that had covered every official entry point was absent here. No infrastructure at all. Simply rock and the specific silence of a place that had been a path once and had retained the path's shape through 2,000 years of disuse. The ash fall in the pass was 18 inches. Not uniform, the wind patterns produced drifts at the passage's narrower points that Aragorn tested with his staff before committing weight. The experienced traveler's habit of assessing before trusting, and 3 times in the first 2 hours the assessment found depths that required routing around rather than through. The temperature at the pass's eastern exit was 47 degrees Fahrenheit above the seasonal norm. Gandalf had told them this number before entry. Numbers, in his experience, prepared people for conditions in a way that descriptive language did not. 47 degrees above norm was a specific figure. It had a relationship to known quantities, to the temperature of a warm room, to the temperature of a fever, to the temperature at which certain materials began to behave differently from their normal behavior. It gave the mind something to calibrate against before the body had to calibrate against it on its own. 47 degrees above norm, in the Efeldath's eastern passes in the 95th day's morning, felt like standing inside a kiln that had been cooling for 12 hours and had not cooled enough. They moved through it at the pace that the ash depth and the visibility permitted. 40 yards in the lower passes, sometimes less when the ash column's ground-level dispersal thickened the air between them and the next visible reference point. Gimli navigated by the stone, reading the bedrock's angle and composition through the ash cover with the dwarven geological instinct that had no analog in any other people's skill set, and which Gandalf had, for the past 3 weeks, been grateful for in the specific way you are grateful for an instrument precisely suited to conditions you did not design the instrument for. The orc camps were everywhere, and empty in the way that the garrison camps had been empty, the specific abandonment of structures that had been populated until recently and were now simply present, their function suspended, their occupants oriented elsewhere by a frequency that left no documentation of its passing. Some camps had fires still burning. The fires burned without purpose in the ash dark, tended by no one, consuming their fuel at the rate fires consume fuel when no one is managing them, which was faster than intended. They did not stop at the camps. Orodruin was visible from the final approach ridge at the 97th day's mid-morning. Visible was the approximate word. The mountain was producing a light of its own, not sunlight, not the ash-filtered gray of the existing sky, but the specific orange-red of active volcanic output on a sustained and increasing scale. The eruption frequency had been building since the ring entered Mordor, the mountain's geological function as the ring's forge reactivating in response to the ring's proximity at a rate that had, by the 97th day, reached a tempo not recorded in any chronicle of the Third Age. The mountain was building towards something. Gandalf looked at it from the ridge for 30 seconds. Then he looked at the 5 of them, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Frodo, in the specific sequence of someone confirming, one final time, that what he intends to do is the thing that needs to be done, and that no element of that confirmation has changed since the last time he confirmed it. Nothing had changed. Frodo, he said, stay with me until the crack of doom's edge. Then I go left. You go right. Frodo nodded once. They went down. The crack of doom's outer chamber had collapsed partially. A section of the original access passage had come down in one of the eruptions, blocking the Sammath Nor's formal entry but leaving a gap at the chamber's southern face where the wall had separated from the volcanic rock and produced an opening sufficient for passage. Aragorn found it in 4 minutes of perimeter assessment while the others held position, and Gandalf stood with his staff in the orange light and watched Barad Doctor's outline through the ash to the northwest. 14 miles. The tower's upper levels were still standing, visible in the eruption light as a silhouette against the ash sky. The lower levels' reorganization had been proceeding for 6 days. The stone at that distance had the quality of material that had found a new equilibrium and was holding it. Not collapsed, not structurally failed, simply different from what it had been. Volcanic glass rather than dressed stone. The angles approximate rather than precise. At the base of the tower, at the ground level, the fire was present. Gandalf had been in the presence of the Balrog twice before in the Third Age. Once in Moria's depths, brief and violent, the confrontation of 2 beings whose natures were opposed in the way that fire and cold are opposed, each the other's negation, the meeting point of destruction that affected both. Once on Xiraxagil, the long contest on the mountain's summit, the fight that had ended his first form and produced his second. He had never been in the presence of what the Balrog was now. What he felt, at 14 miles, was a frequency in the ground beneath his feet. Not seismic, not the mechanical vibration of a geological event. A resonance in the deeper structure. The Maia frequency of a being whose nature he shared in kind if not in quality, amplified past the range at which that frequency was comfortable to be near. Operating in the register that Gandalf the Grey had operated in before Xiraxigil and that Gandalf the White could now recognize without being consumed by recognizing it. He had 4 seconds. He had been calculating the 4 seconds since the 93rd day. The calculation rested on 3 things: the language of the Valar, which the Balrog would recognize below the level of any decision to recognize it, the peer acknowledgement, one Maia to another, which was the only communication the Balrog's nature would receive as communication rather than noise. and the specific quality of his own form after Xaraxagil, which was not the form the Balrog had defeated on the bridge, and was not the form the Balrog's awareness would expect. 4 seconds of attention. That was all. He walked to 60 yards from Barad-dûr's outer wall and spoke. The language of the Valar had not been spoken in Middle-earth at full register since the Second Age's end. It was not a human language, not built from sounds that mouths were designed to make, not structured around the grammar of mortal expression. It was the language of beings whose nature preceded the world's making, and what it sounded like at full register was less a set of sounds than a quality of the air, the specific character of an environment in which something that had existed before the world was present and speaking. Gandalf spoke 9 words. Not a command, not a plea. Not a challenge in the sense that challenges were issued between military forces with opposing tactical objectives. A recognition. One Maia acknowledging another's presence. The formal peer acknowledgement that the Ainur used at the beginnings of things, before the world existed, and before any of them had chosen the shapes they would wear in it. The words said, in the language that preceded the world, I know what you are. I was there when you were made. The fire paused. 4 seconds. Gandalf was already moving in the second, because the 4 seconds were not for him. They were for Frodo, who was moving right along the Sammath Nor's southern wall toward the crack of Doom's edge, with the specific quality of movement that people achieve when their body understands exactly what is required and has decided to be equal to it. Frodo reached the edge in the 3rd second. He did not look down. He placed his bare right hand flat on the stone at the chasm's lip, the specific stone, the volcanic rock of Orodruin's inner chamber, the material of the ring's making place, and stood in the orange light with his hand on the stone and his eyes open, and his face carrying the expression of someone who is, for the first time in 4 months, not reaching for something that is no longer there. The stone knew him. The ring knew the stone. The awareness traveled both directions in the space of 1 second, outward from the stone through the ring's architecture into the Balrog's fire perception, finding the presence it had failed to perceive for 6 months, and finding it now, here, at the mountain's core, and inward from the ring through the stone into Orodruin's geological intelligence. The fire recognizing the place of its making, and the making place recognizing the fire. The mountain had been waiting for this. In the 4th second the Balrog turned toward Orodruin, Gandalf drove his staff into the rock and released the flame of Anor. It was not a fire. It was not an explosion. It was a permission. The specific act of an authority older than the world's making, giving the world's geological pressure the authorization it had been accumulating for 3 ages. Orodruin did not wait. The collapse began at the structural point Gandalf had identified, the eastern face's primary load-bearing formation, which the ring's sustained proximity had been heating past its tolerance for 97 days. The collapse was self-sustaining before Gandalf had completed the gesture. He had known it would be. He had built the calculation around that certainty, that the mountain's internal pressure was already sufficient and required only the precise initiation at the precise point, not the continuation of external force. The mountain came down on the fire from above. He watched it happen from 60 yards from Barad-dûr's wall, which was not a safe distance by any standard he had applied to the word safe in 2,000 years, and which was the distance the geometry of the mission required. He stood there with his staff and watched. In the 3 seconds between the mountain beginning to fall and the stone reaching the fire, the ring's inscription went dark. Not extinguished. Not stopped by force. It had been burning continuously since Khazad-dûm, the fire letters white and constant in the Balrog's flame for 97 days, the inscription of the world's most dangerous sentence burning in the world's most amplifying fire. It went dark in the way a candle goes dark when the wax is finished, the condition that had sustained it reaching its natural end. The inscription completing its circuit for the final time and finding, at the completion's end, nothing waiting for it. The last visible letter was the first letter of the black speech word for bind. It held for 2 seconds. Then it was stone. Frodo saw it. He was still at the edge, still with his bare hand flat on the rock, and the rock was moving now, the mountain coming down in the specific way that geological structures fail, when they fail completely. Not piece by piece but as a system, the whole expressing the failure of its load-bearing point all at once. The light from the inscription had been in his field of vision since he had placed his hand on the stone. He had watched it burn, and watched it complete, and watched it go still. He had carried it for 6 months. He had never seen it end before. It was not what he had expected ending to look like. He had not known what he had expected until this moment, when the actual thing replaced the expectation, and he could see the gap between them. He had expected extinguishing, the forced cessation of a burning thing, power meeting power, the ring destroyed the way enemies are destroyed, by being overcome. What he saw was a thing completing, a circuit run its full length, a sentence finished, a fire that had burned as long as its nature could sustain it, and had stopped when that sustaining was done. The rock moved beneath his hand. The last thing Frodo Baggins saw was the first letter of the black speech word for bind, gone to stone, on the edge of the mountain that had made it, giving up its grip on the world the same way it had always given up its grip on its bearers, not overcome. Finished, Bered Doctor stood. This was the first thing the scouts confirmed, and the confirmation took 3 days because the scouts sent to confirm it came back with accounts that required verification by a second team, and the second team's accounts required verification by a third, because the specific combination of what the tower was and what it had become was resistant to the first description and required multiple independent attempts before the description stabilized into something that could be entered into the record as fact. The tower stood. Its lower levels had reorganized into volcanic glass over the 6 days before Ord Ruin's collapse, the dressed stone's precise geometry replaced by the approximate angles of material that had been asked to be something other than what it was, and had complied without being destroyed. The upper levels were intact, the administrative architecture of 3 ages preserved in the cold. The corridors and chambers and the palantir room at the summit untouched because the heat had risen from below, and the upper levels were above the reorganization's reach. The eye's platform at the pinnacle was present. The mechanism that had produced the eye was absent in the way that all mechanisms are absent when the will that animated them is gone. The Balrog's fire had burned out with the ring. Gandalf had known this would happen. He had built the mission's geometry around it, around the specific principle that the ring's destruction would remove the accelerant that had amplified the Balrog's fire past its sustainable threshold. A Maia of living fire was not a geological event. It was a being, ancient and enormous, but a being with a nature that could be sustained or depleted. The ring had been sustaining it past its natural limits for 97 days. Without the ring, the fire returned to its natural limits. Without its natural limits being sufficient for what the mountain had done to it, the fire went out. Not destroyed. Not imprisoned. The scout's third account used the word extinguished, and Gandalf corrected it in the margin of the report with a single word in Sindarin that translated, approximately, as concluded. The distinction mattered. An extinguished fire could be relit. A concluded fire had run its full length. What lay in the Sammath Nor's collapse, under 400 feet of Orod Ruin's eastern face. Under volcanic rock and cooling lava, and the specific weight of a mountain that had been waiting 3 ages for permission to fall, was not a fire that needed containing. It was a fire that had finished. Mordor was a geological record. That was the most precise language available for what it had become in the months following the ring's destruction. Not a kingdom, not a territory. Not a domain in any political or military sense, but a landscape in which the events of the past 3 ages were written in the mineralogy of the rock and the chemistry of the soil and the specific composition of the ash layer that blanketed everything from the Efeldath's inner slopes to the Nirn's southern shore. The orc armies had dissolved in the weeks after Sauron's dispersal. Not disbanded. Disbanding implied command authority and a commander issuing the order. They had simply stopped. The Morgoth frequency that had been the Balrog's resonance ended when the fire ended, and without it the armies had nothing to orient toward except the direction they had last been moving, and the direction they had last been moving had been toward a fire that was no longer present. And the absence of the fire's direction produced an absence of direction. And in the absence of direction, things that are not armies became not armies with the same quiet inevitability that water becomes ice when the temperature changes. They dispersed into the mountain ranges and the wastelands and the wide territories east of Mordor that Sauron's maps had marked as frontier and that were, in the event, simply geography, ground that existed independent of the political will that had classified it. Most of them did not survive the first winter. The ones that did moved away from Mordor and away from each other with the specific character of creatures whose organizing principle has been removed, and who have not developed the capacity to organize themselves. Nothing grew in Mordor for the first year. The soil chemistry was wrong in a way that the agricultural advisors who assessed it could identify as a measurable condition but could not fully explain. The specific wrongness of ground that has been saturated with something for which the measurement instruments had not been designed. The Nirn slaves were evacuated east in the 3 months following the ring's destruction. The operation organized by the Gondorian military apparatus that moved into the Black Gate's Gap with the specific efficiency of a force, doing the thing it had prepared to do for 3 years. Now, doing it in a context 3 years of preparation had not anticipated, but which used the same skills. Sauron did not return. 40 years after the ring's destruction, a scholar in Minas Tirith's archive wrote 3 sentences in the margin of a geological survey of Mordor's soil composition, and then stopped and looked at what he had written for 11 minutes before continuing with the survey's numerical data. The 3 sentences noted that the specific mineral anomalies in Mordor's upper soil layer, anomalies that the survey attributed to the volcanic activity's unusual chemistry, had a distribution pattern that was not consistent with geological deposition. The distribution was more consistent with dispersal from a point source. He crossed out the 3 sentences, not because they were wrong, because they were not the kind of thing that could be entered into a geological survey without requiring an explanation that the geological survey was not equipped to provide, and that the scholar was not prepared to write in a document that would be read by everyone who used the archive. He filed the survey. The 3 sentences remained in the margin, crossed through but legible, for as long as the document survived. Galadriel did not sail west. Celeborn urged her twice in the first year, and once in the third, and not again after that, because the third conversation had produced in her face an expression he had seen 3 times in 6,000 years, and had learned to recognize as the face of a decision already made and not available for renegotiation. He sailed in the 41st year after the ring's destruction, from the Grey Havens with Elrond and a company of elves whose time in Middle-earth had concluded. She did not go to the Havens to see him off. She sent a letter. He read it once, on the ship's deck, before the coast of Middle-earth had passed below the horizon. Then he folded it and placed it inside his robe against his chest, and did not take it out again. Galadriel stayed in Middle-earth for 53 years after the ring's destruction. She lived in the ruins of Lothlórien for 4 of them, not in denial of what had happened, but in the specific attention of someone who understands that the things you have built deserve witness in their ending as much as they deserved attention in their building. She walked the ash layer where the malern trees had been. She walked the Celebrant's banks. She stood at the bridge once, on the 41st day of the first year, and looked south toward where Mordor was, and north toward where the misty mountains were, and then she turned and walked back into the forest's ruins, and did not stand at the bridge again. Nenya was gone, not removed, present on her finger, the gold still there, the craftsmanship still precise. Simply empty. The warming quality, the sustaining light, the 3,000 years of accumulated intention, absent in the way that a room is absent when the person who made it home has left and you are standing in the furniture. She wore it anyway. She moved south in the 5th year and lived in a house in Gondor's northern reaches for the remaining 48 years. In the manner of someone completing a vigil, whose duration was not specified in advance, but whose completion condition was clear, that whatever might stir in Mordor's silence either stirred or did not. She was watching for the former. At the end of 53 years, she had confirmed the latter sufficiently to be satisfied. She sailed in the 53rd year from the Grey Havens, alone, in the grey morning before the tide turned, without ceremony or company. No one who was present on that morning recorded what she looked like on the dock. The harbour-master's log noted the departure time, the 6th hour of the morning, and the vessel's name and the single passenger, and nothing else. The log was a practical document. The harbour-master, who had watched her walk up the gangway with the specific quality of movement of someone who has been somewhere long enough that leaving it is its own form of completion, understood that what he had witnessed was not the kind of thing a harbour-master's log had the vocabulary for. He logged the departure time, the vessel's name, the single passenger. He closed the log. In the Shire, the winter of the Ring War was remembered for the ash, not for anything that arrived from the south. Not for armies or riders or the specific quality of dread that had moved through the territories below the Brandywine's southern bank like weather moving through a geography it was passing through on the way to somewhere else. For ash. A grey fall that had started in the early months of the year and had continued intermittently for 3 seasons, settling on the Shire's fields in a layer thin enough to be unremarkable and thick enough to have changed the soil's composition in ways that the next spring's planting had accommodated and the spring after that had forgotten. The Shire records noted one entry for Frodo Baggins Esquire of Bag End, Hobbiton. The entry was in the Missing Persons Register, filed in March of the year 2019 by Lobelia Sackville Baggins, who had been attempting to reclaim Bag End through legal process for 4 months before the filing, and who filed the Missing Persons Report less. Out of concern than out of the specific understanding that a missing person was a different legal category from an absent person and carried different implications for the disposition of property. The entry read, Frodo Baggins, missing since September of the previous year. No confirmed sightings, no correspondence. Residence at Bag End vacant. Nothing else. Samwise Gamgee returned to the Shire in the spring of 3019. He planted his garden. The ash-enriched soil took the planting well, the potato beds in particular, which produced that first year a yield 17% above the previous year's average, a number Sam tracked with the precision of a gardener who kept records. He kept records of everything. The growth rates, the rainfall, the soil temperature at the root level, the specific quality of the morning light in each month as it moved through the year. He kept records of everything except the road south. He told no one anything for 40 years. Not because he had been asked not to. Not because the events of the year before had produced in him any of the specific injuries to speech that sometimes follow from certain experiences. He was articulate when he chose to be. Spoke at the Shiri's public meetings with the clarity of a man who had learned that clarity was a form of respect for the people you were addressing. He simply did not speak about the road. The road was not available as a subject in the register that public speech operated in. It existed in a different register. He spoke about it in the 40th year, in the evenings, to his children. Not all of it. Not the tactical details, not the geography of Mordor's inner approaches, not the ash temperature or the volcanic glass or the quality of the sky above the Eiffel Dath on the 97th day. Those were facts that existed in the record Sam had kept, and that would remain in the record when he was gone, and that the record could carry more accurately than speech. What he spoke about in the evenings, in the 40th year to his children, was a road. A road that began in Hobbiton, at the gate of Bag End, specifically, which he described with the precision of a man who had passed through it 10,000 times, and whose memory of it was architectural, and went forward. South and east and down and through. He described the road in the direction it had traveled, from the comfortable to the increasingly not comfortable, from the known to the unknown to the unmappable. He described his companion with the economy of someone who understood that the size of what a person was could not be adequately addressed in language, and that the only honest approach was precision about the specific, small, observable things, the way his companion had carried the broken chain after the bridge, hand pressed flat to the chest, the gesture so constant it had become the body's default state, the way he had sat at fires in the evening and not eaten enough, and had not mentioned the not eating, because mentioning it would have required the others to address it, and the others had enough to address. The way he had, on the 97th day, placed his bare hand flat on the volcanic rock at the chasm's edge and stood there with his eyes open, not because he had been instructed to stand with his eyes open, but because closing them would have been a form of refusing to be fully present in the only moment his presence was the entire point. Sam did not describe the end. His children, who had listened without interrupting for the duration of each evening's account, understood why. The end was in the record. The end was in the entry in the Missing Persons Register, and in the Geological Survey with the 3 crossed-out sentences, and in the Harbormaster's log with the departure time and the single passenger and the nothing else. The end was everywhere in the record. What was not in the record was the road. What was not in the record was a person who had carried something heavier than most people would ever understand, and had not put it down until the mountain put it down for him, and had not, in all the months of carrying it, once asked to be relieved of it in any of the ways that the request could have been made. Sam planted his garden in the spring of each year for the rest of his long life. The potato beds produced above-average yields in most of them. Aragorn, son of Arathorn, was crowned King of Gondor and Arnor in Minas Tirith on the 43rd day after Ord Ruin's collapse. The ceremony was correct in every particular. Faramir, acting as steward in the interregnum following Denethor's death, had overseen the preparations with the precise attention of a scholar, soldier who had been trained in the traditions of Gondor's high ceremony, and who understood that the traditions existed not as performance, but as the accumulated mechanism by which a culture told itself what it believed, about the continuity between its past and its present. The field before Minas Tirith held 10,000. Not the 10,000 who had been supposed to stand in that field on the day the Ring War resolved according to the prophecy it had been written around. Those 10,000 had been an army assembled to face Sauron at the Black Gate, in the story's original shape, the calculated sacrifice designed to draw the eye while the ring-bearer completed the mission. That army had never assembled. The field before Minas Tirith held 10,000 soldiers who had survived a different war, who had fought in the Ash Dark and the Ash Fall, and the specific quality of days in which the sun did not appear and the enemy was not at the gate because the enemy had not needed to come to the gate, had burned through everything between Moria and Mordor without issuing a single siege demand or military ultimatum, or any of the conventional forms by which wars announce their purposes. They had survived a geological event wearing the shape of a war. Aragorn stood before them in the ceremonial armor of Elendil's line, and received the crown from Faramir's hands and placed it on his own head. He spoke for 43 words, not a speech. Not the oratory of a king addressing his kingdom at the moment of his kingdom's founding. Not the elevated language of a man who has spent 37 years preparing for a destiny and has arrived at it, and wishes to mark the arrival with appropriate verbal architecture. 43 words in the plain register of someone making a true statement in the language he actually possessed, without the elevation that the occasion offered and that he declined. The words said that the war was finished, that the work was not, that the work was what it had always been. The daily continuation of a civilization by the people who comprised it, which required food and governance and medicine, and the specific forms of institutional patience that turned a year's survival into a decades, and a decades into a centuries. That he intended to be present for the work. 43 words. He sat down on the throne of Gondor. Not with the specific weight of prophecy fulfilled. The weight of prophecy would have been lighter, clean, the satisfying finality of a sentence completing its grammar. With the weight of 10,000 people in front of him who had not been supposed to fight this war and had fought it anyway, and were still alive and required governance and food and medicine and time, none of which the prophecy had provisions for delivering. The age of men began, not with thunder, not with the light of a reborn sun breaking through the ash clouds at the moment of the crown's placement, though the ash clouds would thin over the following weeks, and the sun would return, and the spring would come, and the potato beds in the Shire would produce above-average yields in the year of the king's coronation and in the years that followed. It began with the sound of 10,000 people still breathing. That was the number. That was the fact the record would carry forward into the centuries that followed, not the prophecy, not the mythology, not the elevated language in which the great events of ages were translated for the consumption of people who had not been present. 10,000. The Count Boromir, son of Denethor, had first performed on a bridge over Khazad-dûm's eastern gate in January of the war's year, arriving at the number 8 and understanding the gap between 8 and 9 as the measure of everything that would follow. The count that had been performed in every camp since, in the automatic habit of people whose formation's integrity was the condition of all their other conditions. 10,000. All present. All breathing. The king sat on the throne of Gondor and the kingdom began, without ceremony and without conclusion, in the only way that anything in the world has ever actually begun, by continuing.